What if everything you thought you knew about Catherine of Aragon was only half the story? She's often remembered as the rejected queen, the devout Catholic who clung to her faith and her marriage until her dying breath. But that version of Catherine, it's painfully incomplete. In this video, we're tearing down the myth to uncover the real woman beneath the crown, Henry VIII's first wife, yes, but so much more than a footnote to his ego. Catherine's story begins on the 16th of December 1485 at Alcalá de Henares, northeast of Madrid. She was born in the Archbishop of Toledo's palace, the youngest daughter of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. She was named for her maternal great-grandmother, Catherine of Lancaster, daughter of John of Gaunt. Her parents had come to their thrones after a tumultuous journey. Both had fought through conflict and battles, and Isabella had rejected offers of marriage that wouldn't have been in her favour, instead both of them contracting marriage secretly with each other in order to keep their respective territories, unusually Isabella keeping her own lands for herself. They had only one son and now 4 daughters, and so the foundation of their delicate balancing act between their kingdoms rested on the shoulders of just one male heir. Catherine's childhood was marked by moving from place to place. The Spanish kingdoms were at war constantly with the Muslim Emirate of Granada, and as a result, home was wherever the Spanish monarchs were following the fighting. Isabella insisted on her children being with her, and so the whole family moved when needed. We know that Catherine was present at the ceremonial conquest of Granada on the 2nd of January 1492, and it's obvious that the city was extremely important to her. When it came time for Catherine to go abroad and marry, she chose for her personal emblem a pomegranate, which in Castilian is Granada. Importantly, this childhood would also have been the foundation of Catherine's faith, something which became so important to her later. Her parents were devout to a fault, and this was sharpened against the contrast of the Islamic faith of the Moors. When Isabella and Ferdinand took the city of Granada, they also took control of the city's mosque, rebranding it as a Christian church. The private home of a leading Moor also changed, becoming a Franciscan monastery. Granada would become the symbol of Ferdinand and Isabella's Christian crusade, a triumph of their faith over that of the Moors. It's little wonder that Catherine would cling to her religion as an adult far from her homeland. But a far more palatable part of Catherine's upbringing that remained with her throughout her life was education and culture. Determined that Spain should be as up-to-date as the rest of Europe, Isabella and Ferdinand invited scholars from across the known world to sit in their universities, commissioned artists to paint not only their own portraits, but those of their children as well, patronised detailed tapestries for their palaces, and encouraged music and dancing. Isabella's own education had been quite normal for a girl when she was young, lacking in many respects, and she was certain she would not allow the same for her children, including her daughters. Not only did her son Juan receive a full education in languages, mathematics, literature and the classics, but so did all of her daughters. Catherine would in years to come repeat this with her own daughter Mary. However, despite this culture and education, Catherine would still have grown up in the knowledge that her destiny ultimately was to become the perfect consort to a royal or noble suitor, and that her duty would be to make heirs. Sometime after 1486, Henry VII of England began to float the idea of a match between his firstborn son, Prince Arthur, and a Spanish princess, namely Catherine. From Henry's point of view, he needed allies to cement his fledgling reign, and Spain was a good choice against the old enemy of France. Likewise, Ferdinand and Isabella had their own faltering relations with France, and favoured an alliance with England for the same reason. By late 1487, the Spanish monarchs had agreed to send ambassadors to England in order to discuss a marriage alongside trade relations and a political alliance. Finally, on the 30th of April 1488, they gave their ambassador Rodrigo González de Puebla the power to negotiate specifically on a match between Catherine and Arthur. But the marriage negotiations were interrupted by a pretender to the English throne, Perkin Warbeck. Anxious about the young man's pretensions to the crown their daughter was to marry into, Ferdinand and Isabella wanted him out of the way and neutralised. When accused by Henry VII of harbouring Warbeck, they quickly organised an investigation into his true origins, revealing to the English king that Warbeck was apparently nothing more than a Flemish man with nice manners. They also tasked their daughter, Juana, with convincing her husband Philip of Burgundy to distance himself from Warbeck. Finally, on the 19th of May 1499, Catherine and Arthur were married by proxy, Puebla standing in for the bride. However, both of Catherine's parents were adamant she would not be sent to England until Arthur was at least 14, and at the time he was just 12 and Catherine was 13. There was also something of an argument over the dowry and money in general. On the one hand, Ferdinand and Isabella didn't want to spend a lot of money, but on the other hand, they also wanted a lavish reception for Catherine's arrival. In 1500, a list of Catherine's proposed household of around 50 people was sent to England, but Henry tried to reduce it. Finally, in 1501, Catherine left Spanish shores for England, arriving in Plymouth in Devon on the 2nd of October. The first thing she did was go to a local church to thank God for arriving in one piece on dry land, which was understandable as her journey had been beset by delays due to her parents seeing off another war and treacherously bad seas. Clearly she hadn't been expected when she did arrive. So Catherine wasn't welcomed by Henry's Lord Steward, Baron Willoughby de Broke, in Exeter until the 7th. She then began her progress to London, where she was joined by Henry and Arthur a few days later in Farnham, Hampshire on the 4th of November. Apparently the Spanish ambassador Pedro de Ayala protested somewhat weakly that in keeping with Spanish tradition, Catherine should be secluded before the wedding. But Henry overrode this and replied he would see her even if she were in her bed before introducing his son to her. Little is known of the first impressions the young couple had of each other, but Arthur wrote to his parents that he would be a true and loving husband, and that he was happy to behold the face of his lovely bride. They then left and allowed Catherine to enter the capital city alone on the 12th, to rapturous crowds and lavish pageants for her honour. She represented an alliance with Spain, now one of the wealthiest and most powerful monarchies in Europe. On the 14th of November, the marriage finally took place at St. Paul's Cathedral. Although the couple struggled to understand one another, they had written letters to one another in Latin, but struggled to understand what the other said as they had learned different pronunciations. Both Catherine and Arthur were dressed in white, the bride in a Spanish style of gown, although it would be several hundred years before white became the traditional colour for wedding dresses. Following the wedding came a grand banquet, followed by something that would in years to come become a much discussed point: the bedding ceremony of the young couple. It was quite normal at the time for a newly married royal couple to be dressed for bed, tucked in, and for this to be witnessed by courtiers. Arthur and Catherine would then have lain under the covers together and waited for a blessing from a priest, first for their bed and then for themselves. After this the priest left, followed by the onlookers, and the young couple would be left alone for their wedding night with the assumption that consummation would follow. The truth of what actually happened could only be known by two people, Catherine and Arthur. Many years later, Arthur's various gentlemen attendants would state that he had joked the following morning about being in the midst of Spain, and that it was a good pastime to have a wife. These remarks would seem to settle the matter of whether or not the marriage was consummated, except that Arthur was unlikely to have admitted defeat, and these remarks were not repeated until many years later. Catherine was silent on the matter, as expected of a princess, but unlike so many royal weddings before, including that of her own parents, there was no display of blood-soaked sheets the following morning. It may seem grotesque to us now, but such a display was proof of a healthy young couple who would create heirs for the kingdom and therefore stability. Years later, Catherine would swear she had lain with Arthur only for 7 nights in their whole marriage, and that sex had never occurred. There was then great discussion over whether or not Catherine should join her husband at Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches, as he was to return shortly after being married. Some of her entourage wanted her to stay in London to familiarise herself with her new country and learn English, but Henry took the decision that Catherine was to join Arthur on the 21st of December. The young couple seemed happy enough together, Arthur busy with council meetings and royal business, Catherine with learning English and learning the ropes of being a future queen. But in March, both of them fell ill with a sweating sickness, a flu-like virus with such intensity it was possible for people to die within a day. Catherine survived, Arthur did not. On the 2nd of April 1502, aged just 15, the eldest son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York died, taking the hopes of a family and nation with him. The problem now came of what to do about his youthful widow. Catherine's elder sister Isabella had been sent back home when she became a widow, but Isabella of Castile and her husband Ferdinand were determined to maintain the alliance between Spain and England. Almost as soon as they received the news of Arthur's death, they floated the idea of Catherine marrying his younger brother Henry. Henry VII and Elizabeth were also keen on the idea, and negotiations opened as they had for Catherine's first marriage. Neither side seems to have worried about the degree of affinity between Catherine and Henry, or in other words, no one cared that they had been sister and brother-in-law. On the 25th of June 1503, they were formally betrothed. But due to the age of Henry, who was still 14, there was room for him to pull out of the agreement when he came of age. The treaty for the betrothal assumed Catherine's marriage to Arthur had been consummated, and while this was agreed by Puebla, it was vehemently opposed by Catherine's duenna, Doña Elvira Manuel. However, it was agreed that covering all eventualities was best, and dispensations were sent for. These were eventually sent out, but they took a number of years to arrive in England, and it's possible there was some doubt over whether a dispensation could even be issued. But by 1504 the situation had changed politically. Isabella of Castile had died on the 26th of November, and while her eldest living daughter Juana was her heir to the Castilian crown, Isabella had left Ferdinand as governor of Castile, possibly because she did not trust Juana's husband, Philip of Burgundy. This meant Henry VII felt he couldn't tie himself too closely to Ferdinand until the situation in Spain became clearer, and just before his 14th birthday, young Henry rejected his betrothal to Catherine. However, she and her Spanish representatives were not told of this, which suggests that the king didn't really want his son to reject the marriage altogether, but rather to keep his options open. But with the death of Philip on the 25th of September 1506 and the disgraceful locking away of his daughter Juana, Ferdinand's rule was cemented. Catherine had been allocated Durham House as Dowager Princess of Wales, the London property of the Bishop of Durham. As her dowry had never been paid in full, she was unable to claim her dower, a third of her late husband's properties and lands, and was instead given £1,200 a year as an allowance from the English crown. However, when Doña Elvira was sent away in November 1505, these payments grew ever more sporadic, and Catherine was forced to give up her lodgings without a proper chaperone present and to live at court. She wrote constantly to her father, telling of the poverty Henry VII kept her in, how she was unable to pay her servants, and how she had even had to sell some of the jewels and plate which made up part of her dowry. Catherine also complained in 1507 that despite living in Richmond Palace with Prince Henry, she hadn't even seen him for 4 months. Eventually she was told about how he had broken off their engagement by Puebla, and she complained bitterly about the ambassador as well. To help with this, Ferdinand also made Catherine an official ambassador for Spain alongside the others. Her letters, however, show hesitancy and are written in her own hand, showing she had no private secretary to help with these tasks. It must have been a highly stressful situation for a young woman in a foreign country, with no control over her own future. In February 1508, this came to an end with the arrival of another Spanish ambassador, Gutiérrez Gómez de Fuensalida, who came with instructions to get the marriage done. Negotiations were painful, and slowly everyone started to believe that the marriage would never happen. Plans were made for Catherine to return to Spain. Only she remained firm, saying that she believed God meant for her to stay in England and become Prince Henry's wife. But by March 1509, even her stubbornness was wearing thin, and she was considering returning home to take holy orders as a nun, and perhaps this would have happened, except that Henry VII died on the 21st of April 1509. Prince Henry, now Henry VIII of England, gave instruction that in fact he had decided he would marry Catherine, and that the wedding should take place as soon as possible. He would claim it was his father's dying wish, but considering the way the negotiations had been going, it's far more likely it was his own idea. On the 11th of June, at the age of 23, Catherine was finally married to Henry, who was a few weeks shy of 18, in a private ceremony in the Church of the Observant Friars outside Greenwich Palace. It was a very quiet wedding, different from the coronation that would take place a few weeks later on the 23rd. The coronation was a suitably grand affair, the route for the royal couple lined with gold cloth and tapestries. Henry led Catherine from the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey, followed by grand banquets and festivities. Catherine had triumphed. Despite having nearly 8 years of difficult and at times humiliating experiences, she had held fast to what she believed was her destiny, and at the time she could not possibly foresee the trouble she would have with her new husband. He was young, tall, athletically built, handsome with red hair, intelligent, cultured, and religious. In short, Henry seemed everything Catherine could have wanted in a future spouse, but hints of his real character started to show through. He publicly asked all those who had suffered injustices to step forward, but many of these were ignored after the wedding fervour wore off, and he imprisoned his father's 2 councillors and tax collectors, Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, who were clearly scapegoats, having them executed quietly some months later. At first, the couple were very happy together. They found each other attractive, attentive, and enjoyed being in each other's company. Shortly after her second marriage, Catherine at last found herself pregnant, leaving no doubt that she had indeed consummated things this time round. But the joy was to be short-lived. On the 31st of January 1510, roughly 6 months into her pregnancy, Catherine miscarried a stillborn girl. However, she was informed that the child was actually one of twins, and that she should expect the other child to be born normally. The news of the stillborn daughter was kept quiet, but of course no other child appeared in the months after either. Catherine was no doubt made to feel even worse about her very public non-pregnancy when Henry started to chase after another woman, Lady Anne Hastings. But nevertheless, Catherine was still young, and it wasn't long before she was once again pregnant. Happy to silence critics who whispered she may not have been able to conceive again, Catherine also became more important in politics. Henry had been brought up on stories of kings going to war, including his own ancestors such as Henry V, but it left him with the desire simply to fight, and to fight France because that's what English kings did. Catherine was more astute in these matters, having been brought up by Ferdinand, her father, the master of political spin, and Henry looked to his pretty young wife to help him in unfamiliar waters. She became a true representative of Spanish interests in England, especially as her father sent her missives to pass on to Henry in her own way. Ferdinand and Catherine between them taught Henry how to conduct the subtle art of political subterfuge, not showing your true hand behind your smile. On the 1st of January 1511, Catherine finally gave birth to the much-longed-for son she and her husband wanted, a boy who would also be named Henry. To her joy, it was a healthy boy, and Catherine seemed to be doing perfectly well after giving birth as well. In London, wine flowed freely. There were bonfires, prayers of grateful thanks, and processions to mark the occasion. To personally honour his wife for giving him a son, Henry took part in a joust as soon as Catherine was able to appear again in public after her churching, his horse's mantle embroidered with the letter K for Catherine. However, once again, tragedy would strike. Just a few weeks after being born, their baby son grew unexpectedly sick and died on the 22nd of February. The grief and shock must have been hard for both parents to bear, and Catherine was heartbroken. But there would be time for more children, and there were other matters of state. When Henry was absent on campaign in France between June and October of 1513, it was Catherine he put in charge of England's affairs. He made her governor of the realm and captain-general, giving her the authority to raise troops, make appointments, and a council to do business with. This shows that Henry certainly trusted Catherine, not only on a marital level but with his kingdom. But on top of this, Catherine was once again heavily pregnant. Thinking it was the perfect opportunity to strike, James IV of Scotland invaded on the 22nd of August. On the 3rd of September, Catherine instructed Sir Thomas Lovell to raise an army in the Midlands, and by the 8th of September, Catherine herself rode north with a reserve army despite being pregnant. On the 9th, Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, who was in charge of the Northern Army, defeated the Scots at Flodden. James IV died on the battlefield with many of his men, and Catherine sent a piece of his bloodied coat to Henry. She had proven herself a queen willing to defend the country she now called home. For the rest of her queenship, Catherine would prove far from being a quiet queen sewing with her ladies. She was more than willing to be heavily involved in politics and war. Her own mother had personally warred against the Moors of Spain. So too did Catherine shape herself to be a warrior queen against the Scots and French. However, possibly because of her endeavours, Catherine once again miscarried a son on the 13th of September. A painful and sad pattern was to follow. The following year, in November or December 1514, Catherine lost yet another child, a son who was stillborn. Henry's dalliances with other women continued and only grew with each lost child. By 1514, Henry's mistresses were now openly spoken of at court. Catherine herself was by now in her early 30s, and her youthful beauty had given way under years of stress and tragedy to a lady settling more comfortably into middle age, if still attractive, carrying more weight after successive pregnancies, and seeming more worldly wise. But her prayers for a living child would soon be answered. She once again fell pregnant in 1515, although Catherine must have felt trepidation at getting her hopes up. But she carried to term and gave birth to a healthy daughter named Mary on the 18th of February 1516, a girl who would grow up to become England's first crowned queen regnant. Catherine's joy at finally being a mother to a living child was unbounded, and through Mary's life her mother would lavish love and attention on her. Shortly after Catherine was able to once again come out into public view, she was given the news that her father Ferdinand had died as she prepared for birth on the 23rd of January 1516. Catherine genuinely mourned the loss, having more trust in her father than she should have, and his grandson Charles, son of Catherine's sister Juana, would take his place as ruler of Aragon and indeed all Spain as he kept his mother incarcerated. He was Catherine's link to her homeland, and in years to come, the scrawny 16-year-old would become his aunt's biggest supporter. Catherine would remain passionate about education, and this continued for Mary as well. While she had come to the English court knowing only French, Latin and Spanish, Catherine had since become fluent in English. She also helped look after the interests of Queen's College, Cambridge, and interceded with Henry to protect Lady Margaret Beaufort's, his paternal grandmother, benefaction to St John's College. She was also described in glowing terms by Erasmus for her academic knowledge at the court. It was also Catherine who helped provide much of Mary's early education, also engaging the Spanish humanist Juan Luis Vives for advice, and to write De Institutione Feminae Christianae, a book on education for young Christian girls. He praised Catherine in his foreword as a model of maid, married woman and widow. By the age of 9, Mary could play music on several instruments, write and speak Latin, and also speak Spanish, French, and possibly Greek alongside dancing. Under Catherine's own pursuit of education and that of her daughter, it became fashionable to educate daughters openly, largely due to Catherine's influence. Despite his disappointment at not having a son yet, Henry doted on Mary and often boasted about her accomplishments. She inherited her father's complexion and red hair with pale blue eyes, but Catherine would only fall pregnant once more in early 1518, and would give birth on the 10th of November that year to another stillborn daughter. It would be her last pregnancy, but there were still other queenly duties, and a year earlier in 1517, Catherine had spoken up for those who were imprisoned after the evil May Day. In early May of that year, distrust of foreigners in London erupted into full-on xenophobia. Fear of jobs being taken, women being stolen, and food taken from the mouths of babes, sounding horribly familiar, meant that innocent non-English people found themselves in fear of their lives. Thomas Wolsey protected his house with cannons and guards. The Portuguese ambassador escaped with his life after being attacked, and the mayor had lost control of the situation altogether. Henry was furious, and after troops were brought in to calm the situation, many of the rioters were hanged. But about 300 prisoners, including 11 women, were not immediately sentenced. They were made to kneel before Henry, sat on a throne under a cloth of state begging for their lives. Catherine apparently turned to her husband with tears in her eyes, knelt with them, and also begged to spare them. So did many of the courtiers present, but it was the Queen who made the biggest impact. Of course, the whole thing had actually been engineered by Henry so that he could appear merciful without being weak, and they were spared to the great joy of everyone. By now, Catherine not only had to turn a blind eye to Henry's many affairs, but also to the illegitimate children such liaisons created. Only one illegitimate child was acknowledged by Henry, a son called Henry Fitzroy, whose mother was Elizabeth or Bessie Blount, who had originally come to court as a maid of honour in Catherine's household. By 1525 it became clear Catherine was not likely to bear any more children, and Mary was treated as Henry's heir apparent. She was sent to Ludlow Castle, much as the Prince of Wales traditionally would have been, although she was never officially given the title Princess of Wales. At the same time, Henry Fitzroy was invested as Duke of Richmond, a move many saw as a possible future path to the crown. Catherine appears to have made her peace with the fact her daughter Mary was the only heir to the English throne. Mary would simply need the right husband by her side, and while Henry played off French and Spanish sides by making and breaking betrothals several times for Mary, Catherine always favoured a Spanish Catholic husband for her daughter. Unfortunately for Catherine, while she had made her peace with the situation, Henry had not. In the same year as Mary was sent to Ludlow in England and France made peace, his wandering eyes settled on one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, the infamous Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was dark-haired, attractive, and alluring. She had spent much of her younger years at the French court, and her dancing, flirtatious behaviour and style of dress were exotic amongst the English courtiers. Anne was between 10 to 17 years younger than Henry, and while she was happy to flirt with the king, she didn't leap into his bed as his other mistresses, including her sister Mary Boleyn, had before. Henry began to believe, or at least publicly said he believed, that his marriage was cursed by God. Leviticus 18 stated that a man was strictly forbidden from sex with his brother's wife, and Leviticus 20:21 warned that such a union would produce no children. The fact that Catherine and Henry had a healthy daughter, and plenty of other parts in the Bible had no issue with a widowed woman marrying her ex-brother-in-law, doesn't seem to have mattered. For example, in Deuteronomy 25:5 it said, "A man should have a son with his brother's widow if a son had not already been born." While this didn't necessarily apply to Christians, it meant no one could be certain the Pope would agree Henry's marriage to Catherine should be annulled. Catherine was horrified at the suggestion that she should join a nunnery and remarked, "God never called me to a nunnery. I am the king's true and legitimate wife." Henry grew impatient with Thomas Wolsey, finding him too slow for the matter at hand. He instead bypassed his cardinal and sent an appeal to the Holy See. Things were made more difficult by the Pope at the time, Clement VII, being a prisoner of Charles V after the sack of Rome. Many tried to stop Henry breaking with Rome. Martin Luther argued that the Bible did not allow for divorce, but did allow for polygamy at times, so why not simply take a second wife? The Pope even offered a dispensation for Henry Fitzroy to marry his half-sister Mary in order to secure the dynasty and allow for royal heirs. But Henry was too stubborn to believe the opinions of others over his own, too fearful that he would be the one who ended his father's fledgling dynasty by not having a son, and frankly, had also probably decided he wanted another wife by this point. Wolsey attempted to convene an ecclesiastical court in England in 1527 with a representative of the Pope, but Clement VII did not want the decision reached in England without him, and so he recalled his legate. Of course, the fact he was a prisoner of Catherine's nephew Charles may have meant he was influenced. Henry by this point will have seen that the Pope would never agree to an annulment while under Charles's control. Henry himself appeared before Wolsey to defend the validity of his marriage, but in May the trial was adjourned while expert opinions were sought, never to be resumed. Catherine was never invited to defend herself and her marriage, but this meant she would easily have been able to appeal any decision made anyway. It seems more likely the whole trial was simply to lay the groundwork for a separation. On the 22nd of June, Henry made his feelings towards Catherine plain when he asked her for a formal separation. Obviously she refused. Seeing her fury, Henry backed down, apparently saying he was only worried for his scruples. Catherine did not sit back and wait to see what would happen next. She immediately wrote to her nephew, Charles, asking him to personally try and dissuade Henry from this course of action, and to force the Pope to summon the case to Rome and revoke any authority Wolsey had. Anne, meanwhile, was still having what could be described as an emotional affair with Henry, and still spent most of her time at court while resisting Henry's attempts to seduce her. She had made it clear that he could only have her as a queen, not as a mistress, and she had also refused his offer of making her an official royal mistress of the court. Not long after, Henry sent to Rome for a dispensation that would allow him, in the view of his marriage to Catherine being annulled, to marry any woman he chose, even within the first degree of affinity. While we would not think them related today, this referred to Anne Boleyn as her sister Mary had been Henry's mistress. He also commissioned various scholars to set out the case. Most of them argued that as Catherine and Henry's marriage was already against divine law, Pope Julius II should never have given a dispensation anyway. Henry also argued that put into the original Hebrew, Leviticus's promise of childlessness only referred to male children. Convenient. And finally, that peace between England and Spain was a poor reason to give a dispensation. In short, Henry was grasping at any straw possible. Catherine, on the other hand, had just one argument, that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, and therefore she was Henry's legal wife in the eyes of God. The problem was that it was an emotional argument, and one that could never be proven. The Pope sent Cardinal Campeggio in October 1528, and under the seal of confession, Catherine swore she had only slept beside Prince Arthur when she shared his bed and nothing else. Popular support swelled for her. It wouldn't help, however. Henry was determined to have his way. And finally in May 1529, a legatine court met at Blackfriars. Catherine appealed to the Pope for the case to be heard in Rome and appeared in person at the court on the 18th of June, noting for the record her denial of the impartiality of the legates and of the fact she had appealed to Rome. A few days later, on the 21st, both she and Henry appeared, the king setting out his case, and Catherine appealing for the honour of herself and Mary. Catherine stormed out of the court when it was clear which way the wind was blowing, despite a summons to return. Catherine was, however, at least for now, still queen. But she and Henry rarely spent time together, and when they did occasionally dine together, it usually ended in a furious row. To Anne's distaste, and that of this modern narrator, in June 1530, Henry was still asking Catherine to make his shirts. But finally, in 1531, Catherine was banished from court and Anne was given her rooms. On the 11th of July 1531, it was the last time Catherine and Henry ever saw each other. She was ordered to the Moor Castle in Hertfordshire, while Mary was to remain at Windsor, and Catherine would also never see her daughter again. By the end of 1532, Anne was probably pregnant, and she and Henry married on the 25th of January 1533. While this is clearly bigamy to us, Henry arranged it with his new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, for his marriage to Catherine to be declared void in May of that year, and his marriage to Anne valid. The Pope excommunicated Cranmer and Henry for these actions. England broke away from the Catholic Church, and Henry took on the position of head of the Church of England. Catherine must have been heartbroken, but she remained steadfast and stubborn, even in defeat, refusing the title of Princess Darga of Wales, willing only to be called Queen of England. She had to move to Buckden in Huntingdonshire with a severely reduced household. The majority of people in the country were on Catherine's side, including Mary Tudor, Henry's own sister. When Princess Mary fell ill in September 1534, Catherine begged to be allowed to see her daughter and nurse her back to health, but Henry refused on the suspicion his daughter might be whisked away to the domain of Charles V. Mother and daughter were not even permitted to write to one another, but there were plenty of sympathisers who were willing to risk carrying notes between the two. Henry offered better living conditions and freedoms to both Catherine and Mary if they would acknowledge Anne as the new queen, but both unsurprisingly refused. Mary was her mother's daughter. Throughout 1535, Catherine continued to fight for her rightful place, urging the new Pope, Paul III, to publicly publish Henry's excommunication. Whether this was because she still hoped to shame Henry into coming to his senses, or simply out of a sense of justice and rebellion, we will probably never know. Towards the end of the year, Catherine grew ill, and in late December she took to her bed. Catherine could feel her death was near, and she wrote up her will. By the 6th of January 1536 she was severely unwell, and she wrote to Charles V to ask him to protect Mary for her. She heard Mass and apparently wrote one last letter to Henry professing her love to him, even after everything he had put her through. A cynic might wonder if Catherine hoped it would hurt him in her absence. The following afternoon, on the 7th of January, the rightful Queen of England died without the presence of her husband or daughter. The person who embalmed her body reported back that her heart was completely black, even though all her other organs were intact. It's very likely this was a cancerous tumour, but equally a suggestion at the time was of a slow-acting poison, which is what her physician chalked it up as. When the news was received by Henry and Anne, they didn't even have the good decency to act upset. Instead, publicly happy about Catherine's death. Henry was relieved as he thought Catherine's death meant Charles V would not go to war with him. And he and Anne wore yellow the following day, a colour which symbolised joy, parading their daughter Elizabeth around. Courtiers at the time were disgusted by the vulgar display. On the day of Catherine's funeral, Anne miscarried a male child, something which was taken as an ill omen. As Henry refused to acknowledge Catherine as anything other than the Dowager Princess of Wales, she was buried at Peterborough Cathedral with little ceremony, and no monument was erected for her. Henry didn't go to the funeral, and he also forbid Mary to attend. Catherine was one of the strongest queens in British history, enduring a lifetime of tragedy with a brave and stubborn resolve. She was a Spanish infanta, along with her siblings, a symbol of a united Spain. Catherine was a valuable bride, being the living embodiment of an Anglo-Spanish alliance not once but twice. She was a young widow enduring years of uncertainty in the wake of Arthur's death. Catherine was also a loving wife and mother, doing nothing but her absolute best to fulfill these roles she believed were given by God, never giving up on either relationship. And finally, despite her rejection by Henry, and her official downgrade to Dowager Princess, she was a Queen of England in every sense of the word. Leading troops in battle to defend the kingdom, being politically involved in England's best interests as well as Spain's, being kind and generous to the poor of her marriage country, and leading England's educational and culture revolution through her own desire to learn. Hundreds of years after her death, Mary of Teck, better known as the wife of George V, had Catherine's status rightfully reinstated as a queen. Her tomb was upgraded, including now the title Catherine, Queen of England upon it, as well as banners declaring the same. Every year there is now a service in her honour at the cathedral, and her tomb is constantly decorated with flowers and pomegranates, her symbol. Perhaps then in death, Catherine is given the honour and respect that her husband should have paid to her in life. Anne Boleyn has to be one of the most famous women in English history, and yet for such a well-known person she's still a mystery. Was she a vicious schemer, or a woman pushed to power by ambitious male relatives? Was she a wronged wife or an incestuous harlot? In short, was Anne Boleyn a good person or a bad person, or somewhere in between? Anne was born into England's 16th century aristocracy to Thomas Boleyn, Earl of Ormond and of Wiltshire, and his wife Elizabeth Howard, who was daughter to Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. She was most likely born around 1500 at Blickling, Norfolk. There is a source which suggests she might have been born in 1507 based on a letter Anne wrote in French to her father, while in the Low Countries in 1514, which historian Eric Ives argues, shows a maturity that could not have been exhibited by a young child, and so it's more likely she was a teenager by then. Anne was the middle child of 3 surviving children, with a sister Mary a few years older than her and her brother George younger than her by around 4 years. Anne's childhood was a secure one. Not only did she come from a wealthy family that had risen to hold claim to noble titles, but she was also given a good education for a girl of her rank. She was taught arithmetic, literature, history, reading, spelling and writing, as well as being taught on religious subjects. Her education would have included practical skills such as dancing, household management, embroidery, good manners, music, needlework and singing lessons. But her greatest education in courtly manners was yet to come. Her father Thomas was a successful courtier, and he did well at the English court, also securing places there for George and Mary. But Anne was to have an even better placement for her teen years. In 1512, Thomas Boleyn was appointed as ambassador to Margaret of Austria, governor of the Habsburg Netherlands, presiding over the most prestigious court in Europe at the time. This meant any young nobleman or woman who found a place there would receive the education of a lifetime. Luckily for Anne, her father impressed Margaret enough to secure his daughter a place at court in Margaret's household. Anne arrived the following year in 1513 as a teenager, and made an equally good impression on Margaret, who wrote that her new charge was bright and pleasant for her young age. This was the point at which Anne's education changed from that simply of a nobleman's future wife to a lady of the court, particularly in learning the French language as her father wanted. Letters from Anne at the time suggest the main reason behind this was to hope for a place in the household of Catherine of Aragon, who spoke French alongside English and her native Spanish. However, in August 1513, Anne instead went to join the service of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, who married the elderly King Louis V. 12th the following year in October of 1514. Mary was only 18 at the time, so, with Anne being similar in age, they likely got on well at the time. However, the French king would live only a few months into his new marriage. By the 1st of January 1515, Louis V. 12th died, leaving Mary a young widow. When Mary Tudor went home to England, Anne stayed in France and became a maid of honour to Queen Claude, who was married to the new King of France, Francis I. Again, Anne was close to Claude due to them being a similar age, and she would stay on there for another 7 years. Anne was able to complete her understanding of the French language as well as a growing interest in French clothing, music, etiquette and dance. Most importantly, she also became well versed in the arts of flirtation and courtly love. These were things that would set her apart from other English ladies at court when she returned home in 1521. Anne was now 21 years old, well educated and an attractive catch for any nobleman. A prestigious marriage had to be arranged. Her uncle Thomas Howard was having issues deciding on who should have the post of the King's Lieutenant in Ireland and saw a way to remedy this with marriage for his niece. The Boleyns, despite being English, had a strong claim to the Orand, but rival Irish claimant Pierce Butler wanted it too. Thomas Howard decided he could offer the position to Butler if there was an arrangement reached that Anne would marry Butler's son James, bringing the two families together and ensuring future claimants would be connected by the marriage. However, the proposal fell through, but Anne wouldn't be short of men willing to ask for her hand. The following year, in 1522, Anne finally secured a place at court as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, Henry VII's wife. A few months later, Anne would be publicly made aware of when she danced at the chateau pageant in honour of the imperial ambassadors on the 4th of March, dressed in white embroidered dresses with gold thread. Courtiers, especially the male ones, were impressed with her grace and stylishness, with others praising her accomplishments, her quick wit, and her intelligence. Despite no actual portraits from when she was alive still existing, it's clear that Anne's appeal went beyond the physical. The descriptions we do have of Anne suggest she had a long face like her daughter Elizabeth, luxurious dark hair, expressive eyes, and a long neck. A friend once described her as good-looking enough. The next candidate for marriage was Henry Percy, later to be the 6th Earl of Northland. He wanted to break off a prior engagement and marry Anne instead, and the pair entered into a secret engagement together. However, the proposal wasn't backed by both his father, also named Henry Percy, and Cardinal Wolsey, and so the marriage never happened. Court gossip by 1525 also suggested there may have been an affair between Anne and the married court poet Thomas Wyatt, but it's highly unlikely Anne would have got herself involved with a married man when she was such a catch. It's more likely, along with many other men at court, Wyatt was emotionally involved with Anne within the protocol of courtly love, but that this was unrequited. It wasn't until 1526 that Henry VIII seems to have really noticed Anne. On Shrove Tuesday, the court took part in a joust, part of the celebrations for the end of a Lent and something that was a favourite of Henry's. Years before, he had ridden out with K's embroidered on his horse's dressings to represent the name of his wife, Katherine. This time he rode out with a burning heart embroidered on his tabard with the slogan, "Declare Gino, declare, I dare not." It was in fact an absolute declaration of his feelings for a woman, for an in fact. But Henry was known for making clear his advances to the next notch on his bedpost, and courtiers would only have whispered about who this might have been in order to gain favours through her. But in 1527, everyone suddenly took more notice. At first, Henry absolutely saw Anne as nothing more than a sexy replacement for her sister Mary, with whom he had just ended an affair. But it would seem Anne held herself back enough that his infatuation grew deeper. The English king was renowned for hating the task of writing letters, and yet between 1527 and 1528, he wrote no less than 17 of them. Catherine of Aragon and Henry were by this point no longer sharing a bed, and they had only one child, a daughter named Mary. By the spring of 1527, Henry had decided he would find a way to put his wife aside in order to remarry and have a male heir. At first, Henry would likely have thought, along with advisers such as Wolsey, that his future second wife would be a foreign princess. However, it wasn't long before Henry might have realised he could have and fulfilled the need for a new wife. The general population were not likely to complain about a homegrown spouse, but nevertheless, Katherine was popular. Anne was also highly skilled in the game of courtly love, and she resisted Henry's attempts while still keeping him interested. However, at the same time, he appears to have convinced Dan that he was in law free to marry. This was on the basis that Katherine had previously and briefly been married to his elder brother Arthur. Unfortunately for Arthur, he had died aged 15, and only a few months into his marriage with his new young bride. Katherine insisted that despite being married, for whatever reason, it had never been consummated. This meant in canon law that technically she wasn't legally Arthur's wife. However, with only 2 people able to prove this was the case and one of them being dead, it was easy for Henry to claim the opposite, and that he was being punished by the heavens for marrying his brother's wife, and that the outcome of this was also that he would not have any living sons, with Henry apparently making it clear he was able to find wife number 2 and must have seen an opportunity. Instead of simply becoming a royal mistress, she could become Henry's next wife. But not everyone was on board with the radical decision of putting aside a wife unwilling to be removed. The Pope, wanting to maintain good relations with Charles V of Spain, Catherine's nephew, who had him imprisoned at the time, put a spanner in the works and publicly declared he was against Henry marrying Anne when a papal dispensation was applied for in the summer of 1527. Fed up with how things were dragging on, Henry decided to do away with waiting for the decision of the Holy See in Rome, instead setting up his own ecclesiastical court headed by Thomas Wolsey. Henry appeared himself in court to defend the validity of his marriage, but then it was decided expert opinions had to be sought which never materialised, and in May the trial was permanently adjourned. The trial's real purpose was probably to lay the groundwork for a separation. And on the 22nd of June, Henry formally asked Catherine if she would be happy breaking up with him. Unsurprisingly, she said no, which made things somewhat more difficult, but during this period, Anne and Henry grew closer, and she began to take on the more political roles of being a queen before actually being one. In the years before their marriage, Anne was able to grant petitions, give patronage, and likely had a great deal of influence over Henry. However, despite the rumours that the king and Anne were already sleeping together, it's more probable they actually weren't, as Henry knew any son he had would need legitimacy. In 1528, the dreaded sweating sickness broke out and Anne retreated to He Castle, but she still contracted the illness. Henry VIII was especially nervous of any severe illness, and he moved constantly around his palaces to keep out of the way of potential infection, including ensuring his daughter Mary, at the time his only heir, was also kept out of harm's way. When Anne fell ill, Henry immediately sent his own physician to care for her, and she recovered shortly afterwards. At first, Anne was happy to wait it out while Wolsey attempted to secure a papal dispensation for his king. But as time dragged on, she lost faith in him. Anne became certain that Wolsey didn't really want the marriage to go ahead, and in 1529 she threw her lot in with other courtiers who wanted rid of him for their own reasons. Thomas Wolsey was a man who had come from humble origins to be by the side of the king, and there were plenty who were jealous of his position. In the same year, Anne's efforts ensured Wolsey was removed from public office, replaced by nobles who proved to be just as ineffective as him at convincing the Pope to change his mind about the marriage. From Anne's point of view, she must have been frustrated with the lack of progress, and she began to turn to more radical ways to speed things up. While in France, Anne had possibly already been exposed to ideas about the Reformation, and she gave Henry selected passages from the book Obedience of a Christian Man, in which William Tyndale argued that kings had authority over the Church. Henry had once been described as defender of the faith by the Pope for his published writings on the authority of Rome. But this idea of kings being in charge of their country over the authority of the Church took root in Henry's head. Devout as he was, he needed an answer to his great matter. However, this was not merely a matter of backing herself a king. Anne appears to have also been genuinely devout and sympathetic to the cause of the Reformation. It's possible that she recognised if she became queen, it would allow her to further the patronage of reformists and encourage their ideas in England. Not long after, Henry sent to Rome for a dispensation that would allow him, in the view of his marriage to Catherine, being annulled to marry any woman he chose, even within the first degree of affinity. While we may not think of them as being related, many people at the time viewed Henry's relationship with Anne as a little too close, since he had also slept with her sister. The king also commissioned several scholars to argue his case, looking for passages in the Bible that basically would allow him to set Catherine aside. Most argued Henry's first marriage should never have been given a dispensation, as divine law stated the marriage was already wrong from the start, and that in Leviticus, apparently translated into the original Hebrew, the Bible promised no sons would be born from a man marrying his widowed sister-in-law. Bible passages to the contrary were conveniently ignored. Further to this, Catherine swore under the seal of the confession that she had never laid with Arthur as his wife, but had merely gone to sleep beside him in the same bed. Tired of waiting for Rome to make a decision, Henry instead arranged for a legatine court to meet at Blackfriars in May 1529. Catherine was called to appear, and she tried to argue for the honour of both herself and her daughter Mary. Henry laid out the case that he was in the right and should set Catherine aside, and when it became clear the whole thing was for show, Catherine understandably stormed out of court. However, Catherine was still queen for now, and she and Henry still had to spend mealtimes and some periods at court together, even if it often ended in blazing arguments. Anne was particularly put out when she realised in June 1530 that Henry was still asking Catherine to make his shirts for him. We can only hope Catherine made them too small just for fun. On the 11th of July 1531, it was the last time Catherine and Henry ever saw each other. She was moved to the Moor Castle in Hertfordshire, while their daughter Mary would remain at Windsor. For a final act of spite, Henry also forbid Catherine from seeing their daughter, and she never would again. Despite the assurances of the English legatine court ruling in his favour, Henry was still uncertain about going ahead with his second marriage. Despite the popular opinion that he broke with Rome, the king in fact attempted to do everything in his power to remain part of the Catholic Church while also getting his own way. But Anne was presumably getting somewhat impatient for results, considering she had held off advances from any other man for the last 4 years, and was now aged around 31. In September 1532 she was created Marchioness of Pembroke, a suitable title for a future queen, and this title was promised to her heirs, legitimate or otherwise. In the winter she travelled by Henry's side to Killala, and had already in the previous months become very friendly with the French ambassador Jules de la Pommure, and was fast establishing an alliance with France. Henry's meeting with King Francis was primarily to engage his support for marrying Anne, especially as Francis and his wife Claude were already familiar with her. As it was, the French government did give their support and Francis met personally with Anne, but the French king still feared angering the Pope and so instead maintained his alliance with Rome. At this point, Anne must have realised there was still some hesitancy in Henry's plan to marry her, and she relented in her own plan not to sleep with him. She understood that now, if she fell pregnant, especially with her biological clock ticking, the king would need to marry her to legitimise their child. It's assumed Anne fell pregnant around the time of the visit to Killala and Henry, and she were married in a secret ceremony on the 14th of November 1532. Anne's family benefited too. Her father was created Earl of Rochford. Her Irish cousin James Butler became Earl of Ormond, and her widowed sister Mary received a pension of £100 that would continue until her own remarriage. As the marriage was considered improper, a second public ceremony took place on January the 25th, 1533, and Anne was declared as Queen on the 12th of April. Henry arranged it with his new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, for his marriage to Catherine to be declared void in May of that year, and his marriage to Anne valid. The Pope would excommunicate Cranmer and Henry for this, declaring that Rome had also broken away from England, urging Henry to return to Catherine. This left Henry as head of the Church of England. Catherine was formally stripped of her title as Queen, instead merely allowed to call herself Deja, Princess of Wales. Anne, meanwhile, was given a lavish coronation on the 1st of June 1533 in a memorable and magnificent ceremony at Westminster Abbey, followed up with a spectacular banquet afterwards. The day before, she had taken part in an elaborate procession through London, seated under a canopy of cloth of gold, wearing her hair loose in the traditional manner. As was probably to be expected, the reception from the public was lukewarm at best. Anne was also the last Queen Consort of England to be crowned separately from her husband, and she was also crowned with St. Edward's crown, which was usually reserved only for monarchs. It's assumed this was because Anne was obviously pregnant by this point, and everyone thought it was a boy. Therefore using St. Edward's crown was like pointing a glaring future king arrow at Anne's stomach. Ironically, the child would indeed be a great future monarch, if not a son. Anne's motto as queen would be the most happy, which was optimistic to say the least, and she chose a white falcon as her personal device, or more specifically, she chose a white falcon alighting on a dead tree stump which then burst into Tudor roses. Subtle. 3 months later in September, Anne went into labour. She had settled herself at Greenwich Palace to prepare for the birth, and all seemed to be going well. All the court astrologers and doctors, but one had confidently predicted a boy, and King Francis had even been asked to stand as the boy's godfather. However, on the 7th of September, Anne gave birth not to a son but to a daughter named Elizabeth. The traditional jousting tournament that had been arranged usually to celebrate the birth of an heir was hastily cancelled, and all notices about the prince quickly had an S shoved on the end of the word to make it princess. It was a huge blow for both Henry and Anne. Although it wasn't the end of the world just yet, Elizabeth was still doted on by both of her parents and especially by Anne, who feared the presence of Henry's other daughter, Mary. To assuage his new wife's worries, Henry had Mary separated from her own staff and sent to Hatfield House, where her new baby half-sister now resided with her own personal staff. It must have been humiliating for poor teenage Mary, who had not only been stripped of her title of princess and forbidden from seeing her mother, but now had to live in the household of a half-sibling that represented the split between her parents. Nevertheless, she was known to be caring towards her baby sister Elizabeth, and also rubbed some courtiers up the wrong way by living far more ostentatiously than Catherine had, with around 250 personal servants and a large, personal female staff of 60 maids of honour. She and Henry both had expensive tastes, however, and so the king allowed her lavish spending on dresses, jewels, furniture, and riding equipment, especially since she once again fell pregnant a few months after Elizabeth's birth. But while this display of wealth was used by her critics to show she wasn't really religious at all, it was expected of monarchy to show off the grandeur of their station, which was still believed to be ordained by God. But what had made Anne attractive as a mistress was less attractive as a royal wife. Her sharp wit, intelligence, and political acumen had made her sexy, but it wasn't considered proper for a queen to argue with her king about matters or to disagree with him at all. Her role now had to be to support him. And after a miscarriage in August 1534, Henry posited the possibility of divorcing Anne without returning to Catherine to crown and Thomas Cromwell. However, this never came to be as the couple made. Up and reunited, and in the following summer of 1535 they went off together on progress to visit Gloucester. However, letters from Anne revealed that Henry was struggling a little in the bedroom, perhaps because of psychological fears playing on his mind about still not having a son. In short, he had blamed his marriage to Catherine for lack of an heir, and it must have become obvious to him by now that he might be part of the problem. But Anne still managed to become pregnant again in October of that year, and hopes were once again high. Tensions began to grow for Anne. On one side was Mary, and the behaviour you might expect from a stepdaughter, pushed out from being future queen by her stepmother. And on the other side were the endless women waiting to take Henry's affections for their own family's gain. Mary, understandably, was unhappy in her new position, and she referred to Anne, as did Catherine, as that woman. Mary also blamed Anne for Henry's insistence that she should accept her new stepmother as queen, and in turn, Anne saw Mary's reluctance to do so as a sign she was still considered a mistress, and nothing more rather than Mary acting as a rightfully wounded daughter expressing her anger. Anne did try to reach out a few times, but she was angrily rejected. Anne didn't do much better with the common folk either. Catherine had been both a well-liked and a well-respected queen, and Anne was sadly neither. Some people did think she was a good queen, but no one liked the way Henry had treated a faithful wife, and even those who agreed with Henry ending his first marriage disagreed with how Princess Mary was treated. But the biggest thing against Anne was the fact she was unavoidably associated with Henry's break from Rome, and she furthered this by openly advocating for religious reforms. Thomas More and John Fisher, two men who spoke out against the reforms, became Anne's enemies at court, and when they were executed by Henry, she too was blamed for their deaths. But Anne didn't sit still as queen. She was especially involved in religion, and had even made a special study of the epistles of St. Paul. The Bible text Anne used was a French translation, which made sense considering she was likely to have picked up her taste for spirituality while at the French court. Some copies of evangelical French text even survive in the royal library that was sought out for Anne herself. Her brother George helped produce a hybrid copy of the Bible that was in the legal French language, but the more disruptive commentary was translated into English. Anne also ensured England was a safe haven for reformers fleeing persecution, and she had a hand in encouraging Henry to patronise like-minded clergy as well as doing some of this herself. And despite it being illegal still to have a copy of the Bible in English, a lectern Bible in English was available for her household to use, and Anne even owned an illuminated copy of William Tyndale's translation of the New Testament. Anne also had a particular interest in changing the monasteries. Like other reformers, she didn't actually want to get rid of them altogether, but simply to change their use for educational purposes. She was also concerned with poverty, and she attempted to alleviate the problem with her own personal charity, but also with providing job opportunities where possible. It is interesting that her daughter Elizabeth would be the monarch to overhaul the centuries-old, problematic laws regarding poverty years later. Anne also contributed heavily to culture through her patronage of Hans Hollein. If you've seen any famous painting of the Tutor from Henry VIII onwards, there's a good chance it was either Holbein or someone copying a Holbein. She was his first patron in 1532 before her royal husband, and Hollein even designed an arch for Anne's coronation procession, as well as creating a rosewater fountain for Anne's New Year's gift to Henry in 1534. The painting Les Sœurs, Ambassadors, is even a nod to Anne. The portrait is of Jean d'Intivy and Gordel, two French diplomats who took part in Anne's coronation. The painting was done close to the time of the coronation and contains many symbols that pertain to the time of Anne's crowning as well as reflecting many of her religious views. But regardless of the good Anne did as queen, she was soon to meet her downfall. Strangely, this began with the death of Catherine of Aragon, who died on the 8th of January 1536. The country was scandalised when Henry and Anne chose to wear yellow instead of black for mourning, yellow being the colour to represent joy. They did not hide the fact they were happy at the death of the king's first wife. Anne once again reached out to Mary to attempt to salvage their relationship, but the princess rejected her, especially as there were now rumours Catherine of Aragon had been poisoned. However, the basis for this was that her embarrass found her heart was completely black, and most people at the time thought this to be poison, but modern analysis suggests Catherine probably died of heart cancer. The Queen, knowing Henry now had little standing in his way of a third marriage if he decided to set Anne aside, knew she had to give birth to a boy. But it was also around this time the ageing king's wandering eyes settled on one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, a young woman called Jane Seymour. The story goes that he apparently gave her a portrait miniature of himself, and Jane was messing about opening and closing it in Anne's presence. After seeing what the locket contained, Anne snatched it so hard from Jane's neck that her fingers bled. Just a week or so later, Henry took part in a tournament and was knocked so hard from his horse that he was knocked unconscious for 2 hours. Whether it was one of these incidents, bad luck or karma, Anne miscarried her unborn child yet again. To make matters worse, the baby was a boy. Eustace Chapour, the imperial ambassador at the English court, gave the doom-laden comment, "She has miscarried of her saviour." However, despite this popularly being seen as the point at which Henry put Anne to one side, she was actually still in a strong position at this point. Although Anne's enemies did start to plant the idea in the king's head of replacing her for Jane, Henry doesn't seem to have made any serious moves in that direction. Even in April 1536, he was still trying to get Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and his daughter Mary, to both accept Anne as the rightful queen. The real sticking point actually came when Cromwell and Anne fell out over what should happen to the assets from the monasteries, and wanted to give the money to charitable and educational institutions, whereas Cromwell wanted to put the money directly into the royal coffers, and even tried to use preachers to modify royal policy on dissolving the smaller monasteries before it passed through Parliament, but to no avail. Her almoner, John Skipp, gave a sermon condemning Cromwell as an avaricious and evil adviser. Anne also favoured a French alliance, as she had for many years, and Cromwell preferred an imperial alliance with Emperor Charles. While it's obvious the two once strong allies now fell out, historians disagree as to whether this meant Cromwell set about planning Anne's downfall, or if he was simply acting on the orders of Henry. Whatever the case, whether it was Cromwell trying to remove Anne once and for all to allow his political diplomacy with Spain, Henry wanting to rid himself of a wife who was now becoming more trouble than she was worth, or even if there was some genuine concern the Queen had lovers, Anne wouldn't last much longer as Queen. In late April 1536, Anne had a very public falling out with Henry Norris, groom of the stool to the king, but also someone who had previously been one of her biggest supporters. Picking a vulnerable target for Anne's lively and colourful entourage, Cromwell had her court musician, Mark Smeon, arrested. He was questioned and possibly tortured, eventually giving a confession that stated he was the Queen's lover. But as he was likely tortured and at least pressured, this confession was probably not genuine. A few days later, during the May Day joust, Henry Norris was arrested, but as he was an aristocrat, he couldn't be tortured. He denied all charges of adultery, and he also added that the Queen was innocent. On the 2nd of May, Anne was sent to the Tower, as was her brother George, followed by other courtiers, Francis Weston, William Barreton, Thomas Wyatt, the same poet who had felt so strongly towards Anne years before, and Richard Page. When Anne was taken to the Tower, she collapsed, begging to know the whereabouts of her father and sweet brother. They were all charged with adultery, including George Berlin, who also had the charge of incest against both him and Anne. Never before or since had a queen publicly been accused of sleeping with her sibling, and it sent shockwaves through the court and country. Most modern historians are overwhelmingly of the opinion that Anne was completely innocent of all charges. The only one of the suspects who ever confessed was Smeon, and he was likely either pressured or tortured to do so. Norris was offered a pardon if he would confess, but he refused. Weston did not like Anne, and he was only dragged in because of a comment she made while in the Tower. Barreton was added to the list by Cromwell, most likely to end his control over the Welsh Marches, allowing Cromwell to reorganise the local government of Cheshire and the border area to his liking. Wyatt and Page, both known to be fans of Anne, were just lumped in to make it seem real, and were never really intended to be executed. Grand juries in Middlesex and Kent found indictments on the basis of the Treason Act of Edward III, in which adultery by and to a queen was a form of treason, as then the children of the queen might not be legitimate. The story was twisted that Anne and the others had planned to kill the king and then marrying one of her lovers and taking the throne. It sounds unbelievable now, and it must have then as well. Henry, meanwhile, to the delight of those who wanted an out of the way, was being kept busy with Jane Seymour's charms. On the 12th of May, 1536, Weston, Breton, Smene, and Norris were sent to trial and found guilty of high treason. This then made Anne and George's trial on the 15th of May before a jury of 27 peers in the Tower rather pointless, as the jury simply had to agree to what had already been decided in the other trial. Anne and George were found guilty of adultery, incest, and high treason. And 2 days later, on the 17th of May, Cranmer found the marriage between Anne and Henry null and void, which also begged the question how she had been adulterous if she wasn't really married. Logic did not prevail in this mess. If nothing else, Anne was a woman who had gone 4 years, holding off not only from men in general, but from a king, while also convincing him to give up his first wife and marry her instead. All while her child-rearing years ticked by, she clearly was not a woman stupid enough to throw everything away for a lover, whoever it might have been. And on top of that, Anne was continually surrounded by a large retinue of female staff at all times, including her ladies-in-waiting, which would have made any romantic error of judgment completely impossible to hide. In other words, had the affairs really happened, Anne would have had to have at least a couple of ladies-in-waiting helping her. And yet none of them were ever charged, and all were kept on to serve the next queen, Jane Seymour. Anne maintained her innocence throughout the trial and afterwards, and she had ready and constant answers to the questions put to her. Twice she would swear on the sacrament that she was innocent of all charges against her. Her brother George and the other men were all executed on the 17th of May. Anne seemed content and ready to die. She accepted her fate as there seemed little way out when she knew she was innocent. The only mercy Henry showed was to commute her sentence from being burned alive to being beheaded. And as Anne was a queen, instead of being executed with a common axe, Henry had an expert swordsman from France brought to England. There is no doubt that Anne probably suffered a severe mental breakdown and depression with what was happening, made clear by a statement from William Kingston, the constable of the Tower at the time. On the morning of the 19th of May, he wrote, "This morning she sent for me that I might be with her at such time as she received the good Lord to the intent I should hear her speak as touching her innocency always to be clear. And in the writing of this she sent for me, and at my coming she said, Mr. Kingston, I hear I shall not die before noon, and I'm very sorry therefore, for I thought to be dead by this time, and, pass my pain, I told her it should be no pain, it was so little. And then she said, I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck. And then put her hands about it, laughing heartily, I have seen many men and also women executed, and that they have been in great sorrow, and to my knowledge this lady has much joy in death. Sir, her almenina is continually with her, and had been since 2 o'clock after midnight. This was clearly a woman who was attempting to make sense of her impending death in the best way she could. On that same morning, Anne was led to a scaffold that had been erected on the north side of the White Tower, wearing a dark grey dress of damask trimmed with fur with a red petticoat beneath. Accompanied by 2 female attendants as she walked, onlookers remarked that Anne did not look upset and that she had a devilish spirit about her, and seemed happy, as though she was not about to die. She climbed the scaffold and made a short speech in which she still, tellingly, did not confess to the crime she had been accused of. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, but according to the law, by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler, nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." At least one witness said later that the crowd were unable to hold back tears at Anne's words, and were much impressed with her bravery. Her mantle was removed, her hair tucked into a kiff, and a blindfold put around her eyes. She bid farewell to her ladies, asked for final prayers, and knelt upright in the French fashion. There is a story that the executioner had actually hidden his sword under a heap of straw, knowing how nervous Anne would be. His assistant made a sound near the scaffold steps, allowing Anne to turn her head towards the sound, still blindfolded. Having removed his shoes to make his steps soundless, the executioner took his sword and swiftly brought off the Queen's head while she was still uttering her prayers. It was done as quickly and smoothly as it could be. One of the ladies present threw a white handkerchief over Anne's head. Her remains were buried without a marker in the Tower Chapel of St. Peter Adventurer. After Anne's death, her father was turned out of his position as Lord of the Privy Seal, and Jane's brothers Thomas and Edward were both given lucrative positions and titles. Henry was betrothed to Jane on the 20th of May, just the day after Anne's death. Princess Mary and her supporters didn't get what they hoped for, as Henry still remained steadfast in his reasons for abandoning Catherine of Aragon, and in June, Mary finally submitted to her father's will on the matter. Anne would remain largely unspoken of throughout Henry's reign, and all portraits of her were destroyed. This would be unchanged until Mary became queen, when she would vilify, and once again to both honour her father's memory, while still justifying a return to Catholicism. It wasn't until Elizabeth became queen that her mother's reputation would be somewhat repaired, instead repainting Anne as a Protestant martyr and a faithful wife. Anne was a complicated woman, and it's difficult to get a handle on how many of her actions were of her own volition, how many were because of the situation she found herself in, and how many were exaggerated by her enemies. It's certain that Anne knew what she wanted from life, and it's difficult to get away from the fact that she seemed at times not to care how that happened. The way in which she helped treat Catherine of Aragon was horrific, and it's something that makes it difficult to like her. But equally, how much was Anne encouraged by Henry to behave this way, and how much was actually herself, is something we will probably never really know. While it's true Anne had a temper and got into arguments, it shows she was passionate about what she believed in, and she certainly had conviction in her faith. There are even hints that Anne wanted to improve things for the ordinary people of England through her own patronage and charity, through wanting to create work for those who needed it, and for insisting money from the monasteries should go to charity and education. In short, Anne was the other woman, but she was also human, and no one is one-sided. And regardless of how she behaved, Anne did not deserve the fate which awaited her. It's highly likely she was innocent of all charges against her, and she herself defended this until the day she died. It's clear Henry had decided to be rid of her in the only way left to him. And as with all of his subjects, Anne had to lay down her life to the tyrant Henry VIII had become. She was a complicated woman who had shone so brightly in life, and had tried to do really what all women of her time did, tried to get the best marriage possible and the best life possible from that. But in Anne's case, just like Icarus, she sadly flew too close to the sun and paid for it with her life. Despite being the queen who finally gave Henry VIII his much-longed-for son, Jane Seymour is also the most enigmatic. Little is really known about her, and yet she would help end a marriage much as her predecessor had, give birth to a future king, and be the only wife to be buried with her king. Jane was born in the early 16th century, sometime between 1504 and 159, most likely around 1508, and at Wolf Hall in Wiltshire. Her mother, Marjorie Wentworth, and her father, Sir John Seymour, were not members of the nobility, but were still part of England's well-to-do gentry. And besides this, Jane was still a descendant of King Edward III through his son Lionel of Antwerp, 1st Duke of Clarence. Sir John had done well for himself under Henry VIII being kneed in return for his efforts against a Cornish rebellion a few years before Jane's birth, and he was also Sheriff and Justice of the Peace for Wiltshire at that time. Jane was also part of a large family. She was one of 10 siblings, 4 of whom would not survive to adulthood and most likely died of plague. 2 of her brothers, Edward and Thomas, would go on to have prominent roles within history themselves, but her brother, Henry, instead led a quiet life as a country gentleman. Her 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Dorothy, went on to have good marriages into the gentry and nobility. Unlike Henry's first 2 wives, Jane was not highly educated. Her parents had given her a very traditional style of education for a young woman expected only to marry well and produce heirs while helping manage an estate. A priest was hired at Wolf Hall, most likely for her brothers, but it is possible it was partly for the daughters in a rudimentary way. As an adult, Jane could read, but she could not write beyond her own name. She would have learned about household management, cooking, riding, and needlework. This was the skill in which Jane would shine, and examples of her amazing tapestry work and embroidery survived as late as 1652. When she was still a teenager, she was sent to court as a maid of honour to Queen Catherine, Henry VII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And under the Queen's careful example, the court became a place for young women of the gentry and nobility to learn how to behave at court. In later years, during her own reign, Jane would use the example of the Queen she had idolised in her youth. When Henry VIII decided to put Catherine aside to pursue Anne Boleyn, Jane was a firm supporter of Catherine despite some other members of her family such as her sister Elizabeth supporting Anne. However, at the time she was a maid of honour, Anne Boleyn would have been the same before becoming a lady-in-waiting, and so they likely knew one another, although it isn't recorded what they thought of each other. Jane also grew to know and like Princess Mary, who would have only been a few years younger than herself. It was something that would ensure when Jane became queen, she would do her best to repair the damage that had been done to Mary by her parents' separation and the way her mother had been treated. Having said all this, although Jane may even have been one of those who initially went with Catherine when she was sent away to the Moor Castle in Hertfordshire, she and her family were ambitious enough to recognise this wasn't the way forward. By Christmas 1533, Jane was in Anne Boleyn's household as one of her ladies-in-waiting. Anne had an enormous number of female attendants, and so Jane's previous experience at court would have helped her easily find a place. Henry VIII presented gifts to all of Anne's ladies that Christmas, including Jane, and therefore he might have known of her at least. But it was in September 1535 that Henry began to really take notice of her. His relationship with Anne had been stormy for a long time after marrying her in January 1533, and he now regularly argued with the new queen. Added to this was the complication that she still hadn't given him the much-longed-for son he desired, and it only needed the right pretty face to drive a wedge between them. But in September, Henry decided to visit Wolf Hall. As Jane's family were only gentry, a royal visit was a very big deal. It was also an extremely expensive undertaking, as the royal family and their retainers had to be taken care of, and usually for a somewhat nebulous amount of time. But the king was known to be pleasant and not demanding of his host, and all would likely have enjoyed the hunting in the nearby Savernake forest. Jane was a stark contrast to Henry's queen. Anne was flirtatious, exotic in her French dress and games of courtly love, and fiery in her opinions. And while this was highly attractive in a mistress, it was less attractive in a wife who had to be queen, a position that suggested supporting the king and not arguing with him. Jane may have been quietly ambitious, but she hid it under a veil of demure innocence with a quiet, eager-to-please demeanour. As we've discussed in another video about Henry VIII, he idolised his mother Elizabeth of York, who died when he was still young. Elizabeth had been calm and gentle in nature, and supported her husband seemingly without argument throughout their marriage. This cemented in Henry's mind what the ideal queenly wife should be like, and Jane seemed able to be held to this standard. By this point she was also in her late 20s, unusual at a time when most women in the gentry nobility were at least engaged by their mid-teens. She wasn't known to be pretty, but soon Anne and the court knew Henry was quite taken with the supposedly plain Jane, and was pursuing her with a view to having her as a mistress. But Jane cleverly turned Anne's trick to become queen to her own style. She also held Henry off sexually, claiming that she had strong feelings for the king, but also that her chasted nature would not allow her to do such an improper thing as be a mistress. Playing hard to get worked, and Henry was only more attracted to Jane's display of heartfelt sweetness. Others noticed this budding relationship, especially those who wanted rid of Anne, mostly for her fervent appreciation for the new Protestant faith, as well as for the fact she simply wasn't popular and had yet to yield a male heir to the throne. In Jane they saw an opportunity, including the ever-present Tudor commentator Eustace Shapis, who served Charles V as imperial ambassador to England. Those courtiers who saw a way to use Jane to be rid of and encouraged Henry in his efforts to have an affair with her. And as Jane's family were part of those who despised Anne and had sided with Catherine, no doubt they also encouraged Jane to show the king some affection to give him hope. When both Jane and Henry were back at court, their affair intensified emotionally, and many people began to report that the king appeared to be in love once again with a woman he wasn't married to. Edward and Thomas Seymour were also at court, and they were careful to remind their sister not to give up her virginity and remain modest and virtuous at all times. She did this perfectly, keeping Henry at bay on the promise of more sensual pleasures if marriage was on the table, basically pulling the same trick Anne had done, and yet again Henry was pulled in by it. History has often painted Jane at this point as little more than a tool used by a ruthless and ambitious family. But this really sells her very short. Jane herself would have to prove she was not only determined and aspirational, but also that she was capable of putting her conscience to one side in the pursuit of the husband of the Queen she served. Jane was often alone with the king in many situations, and her resolve against his advances had to be ironclad, something that could only happen if she herself was the driving force behind the plan to seduce Henry into marriage. But at least part of her ambition also came from her desire to return to the Catholic faith and reunite England with Rome. On the 7th of January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died, most likely from a tumour on her heart. Although Henry and Anne, both outwardly, much to the disgust of their courtiers, showed their relief at this by wearing yellow, there were still few signs that Henry was planning on putting it aside. But this was due to her being pregnant, and this was her final hope at proving herself. Sadly for Anne, she would miscarry before the end of the month, but the cause of this would be rumoured as mental anguish involving her husband and Jane. On the afternoon of Catherine's funeral, the Queen entered a room only to find Jane sitting on Henry's knee. She flew into a rage, and fearing for the sake of his unborn child, the king sent Jane away and tried to calm Anne. Unfortunately, nothing helped, and the stress of these incidents took their toll, leading to the Queen miscarrying that evening. As Jane was also being courted at this time by those who wanted an alliance once more between the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and Henry VIII, she was no doubt also whispering poison in the king's ear about and during this time. Henry also made sure to maintain a respectful distance from Jane while still showing his interest, keeping her name free of scandal while showering her with gifts. Anne had noticed Jane idly messing about with the locket around her neck, opening and closing it while looking down like a lovesick puppy at the portrait inside. Anne was well aware of who Jane was probably looking at, and after confirming it was a miniature portrait of Henry, she snatched it off Jane's neck, supposedly so hard that her fingers bled. There was an incident not long after this in which Henry sent Sir Nicholas Carew from London to Jane with a purse of money and a love letter. Jane had accepted all gifts until this point, but a gift of money was a bit too much. She decided to use this moment as a massive glowing hint, with a suitably theatrical performance to back it up. Kissing the letter with all reverence, Jane handed it back unopened and fell to her knees, begging that the king consider her position. She added that she would happily take the king's gift of money, but she prayed him to do so when God might send her a husband to marry. The king was delighted with her show of virtue, and said he would from that point on only speak with Jane in the presence of her relatives. Rooms were arranged for Edward Seymour and his wife Anne that were connected to Henry's rooms by a secret gallery, and it was also arranged that Jane would share the suite with her brother and sister-in-law. Within a few months, Anne had been accused of sleeping with several men, including not only a musician within her household and several courtiers, but also her own brother, George Boleyn. Despite Anne's less attractive qualities, most modern historians agree the charges were a load of nonsense and were a convenient way to get rid of her. The Queen was placed in the Tower of London and found guilty of adultery, incest, and high treason. On the morning of the 19th of May, apparently with an acceptance of her fate, Anne Boleyn was led out to a scaffold and beheaded. Henry was out hunting at the time. On the 14th of May, a few days before, Henry had installed Jane in a house in London. She was waited on by servants from the king's own household, and it would appear she calmly took on this new role for herself, with no thought given for the woman who would soon vacate the place Jane wanted to occupy. And while on the 19th Henry wore white as a show of mourning for his now late queen, as soon as learning Anne was dead, he made his way with all haste along the Tomb to the Strand where Jane was waiting. For her part, she spent little to no time thinking about Anne Boleyn, instead spending most of the day sorting out her wedding attire. Even the Privy Council were behind the speedy decision for Henry to marry Jane. Most likely due to the need for a legitimate heir as his illegitimate son, the Duke of Richmond was dying, and his two daughters were no longer considered legitimate. Henry and Jane were formally betrothed on the 20th of May, just the day after Anne's death. And if you think that was fast and tactless, it was nothing compared to the fact that they were married just 10 days later on the 30th at the Palace of Whitehall in The Queen's Closet by Bishop Gardner. Jane was a popular figure amongst the ordinary people of England as well, with stories of her virtuous behaviour and her compassion for Princess Mary doing the rounds. Henry gave her a wedding gift of 104 manors in 4 counties, as well as many hunting chases and forests to provide for her income during their marriage. A week later, Henry was optimistically speaking of a son who was hoped for in due season, suggesting that the wedding had been successfully consummated. Not long after their honeymoon, the royal couple moved to Greenwich, and on the first Friday there, Jane dined in public with her husband, impressing the courtiers present with her gentleness and demure nature. As queen, she would make her reign very different from Anne's. Where Anne had wanted her own way, Jane showed herself willing to bend to Henry's wants instead. Something played out by her personal motto, bound to obey and serve. Jane also impressed members of the court, not by being dazzlingly beautiful or witty, but by being moderate and pleasant. Most liked that she was pious, but not too over the top about it. The extravagance and lavish entertainments that had been enjoyed by Anne was swept aside, and Jane also banned the French fashions that her predecessor had popularised. If Jane had a flaw that was noted by others, it was that she kept herself apart from her now social inferiors, and she was viewed as cold and arrogant at times, wanting to keep a strict etiquette at all times within her household. She also, despite her desire to be as opposite to Anna as possible, increased the number of her household from 168 to 200. On the day her ladies were being sworn in, the king wasn't present, instead listening to a report from his Privy Council about Princess Mary's conduct during a recent visit they had made to her. Henry was furious about how she was still very understandably against him. He wanted to have her put on trial for treason for some of the things she had said, and Jane gently tried to beg him not to go forward with this course of action. Henry responded by telling Jane she must be out of her senses, just in case she hadn't received the memo. Jane quickly learned to tread very carefully with the abusive behaviour of her husband. Luckily, very few other people agreed with the king, and he was persuaded instead to make Mary sign a series of articles declaring her mother and father's marriage as incestuous and recognising Henry as head of the Church of England. On the 4th of June 1536, Jane was publicly declared as queen. However, her coronation wasn't planned, and she never actually would be crowned, most likely due to a combination of plague holding things back and her untimely death. The decision to withhold her coronation seems to have been based on Henry wanting to ensure she gave birth to a son before it happened. But Jane had 4 main aims: remain queen, give birth to a prince, help Princess Mary be reinstated to her rightful place, and of course, help her own family further up the social ladder. Having watched Anne's attempt at being queen, Jane will likely have understood it made more sense to take her time and move slowly with the little influence she currently had. She and Anne's successive wives knew they would never hold a position against Henry the way Catherine or Anne had, and they would instead need to be submissive and adoring at all times. For Henry's part, he does seem to have cared about Jane and loved her as she was. He was fond of stating she was his first lawful wife, although his passion for her died down once he actually had her as his wife. The same as had happened with Henry's previous 2 spouses, but he was also an indulgent husband, and Jane was constantly being given jewels and new fashionable clothing, as well as a glittering inventory of furniture for her rooms. By this point, Mary had also realised that her father was only going to show her clemency if she subjected herself to his demands. Both her cousin Charles V and the ambassador Chapis had assured Mary she would be absolved by the Pope if she did sign the articles, understanding the young princess had no way to be safe if she refused. On the 13th of June, though it must have been a horrible thing to force herself to do, Mary signed what was required of her, sending the articles with a letter, begging her father for forgiveness, and stating that she knew she had offended him so badly she didn't even dare call Henry father. The knowledge in Mary's mind that she had finally given in for worldly reasons while others suffered for their Catholic faith would haunt her for the rest of her life. Despite this being an obvious place of abuse she had little choice in, even then, Henry had to have the last word. And instead of accepting this apology, which was never really needed anyway, irritated at being made to wait so long for it, then asked Mary to write a more detailed letter of her faults, and to list some ladies she would like in her household should he decide to return Mary to favour. Poor Mary was pathetically humble in her letter, doing as he asked and appearing grateful for it. But Jane was overjoyed at Mary's capitulation, and having distanced herself from those who were familiar but mere gentry, now was glad to have the opportunity of a friendly face who was close to her own rank. During the King and Queen's progress in the summer, Jane sent her brother Edward to visit Mary and obtain a list of the clothing she would need on her return to court, also gifting the princess a fine horse. But the last few years had taken a toll on Mary, and while the king publicly announced he was to be reconciled with his eldest daughter, she was too fragile for anything but a private meeting. It took place at a house in Hackney on the 6th of July, with the king and queen meeting with Mary at her rooms. Their retinue overheard Henry speaking gently and kindly to Mary, saying how much he regretted having kept her apart from him for so long, but the rest of the conversation was in private. Jane gifted Mary a diamond ring, and Henry gave Mary 1,000 crowns to spend on whatever she wished, adding that he didn't want her to worry about money and that she should have as much as she wished from that moment on. By the 13th of October, a new problem had arisen in the kingdom. However, a protest began to rise in Yorkshire, spreading to other parts of the north of those who still disagreed with Henry's break with Rome and wanted to see a return to Catholicism. This would become known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. It's possible with the return of Mary to favour and Jane sympathetic to the faith, they felt there was a chance their pleas would be heard. Jane attempted to ask for pardons for some of those involved in the uprising, as well as to restore some of the smaller monasteries that had been dissolved. This was not unheard of since Anglo-Saxon times. It had been the place of the Queen to beg for clemency for prisoners, often with a behind-the-scenes agreement already in place that the king agreed but didn't wish to appear weak. But in Jane's case, her proposition was thoroughly rejected with an explosive burst of Henry's foul temper. And Henry reminded her of the fate Anne had met with when she tried to meddle in his affairs, ordering Jane to attend to other duties. The threat was very real, and Jane backed down, perhaps telling herself that when she had a son, she might have more clout. And despite the reconciliation with Mary, Henry still wanted his son. There is some suggestion that Jane might have miscarried a child around Christmas 1536, although the source for this is somewhat shaky as it came many years after the period. It's possible that the insults levelled against Henry at Anne's trial, that the problem of infertility lay with Henry due to his increasing age, were true. But by January 1537, Jane was certainly pregnant, whether it was the first or second time. Henry's nervousness about it being a healthy pregnancy was obvious by Jane's movements once she knew she was carrying a child. Already limited to just domestic duties and running her own estates and household, Jane further withdrew from public life over the summer at Hampton Court. Living a quiet life with no public engagements, Jane developed a craving for quail, which Henry had brought over from Killala in huge amounts, and Mary and other courtiers also gifted it to Jane. The quail was shipped over with the aid of Arthur Plantagenet, first Vic Count Lisle, an uncle of the king. In a token of appreciation, Jane set out to help his wife, Honor Grenville, Vic, Countess Lisle, to find a place for one of her two younger daughters, Mary and Katherine. Jane ordered both girls to be sent over to Hampton Court with 2 gowns each, one of silk and one of damask, so she could choose the girl she liked the best for her own household. The girl not chosen would be given a place in the Duchess of Suffolk household. Jane would also only provide food and wages. It was up to Lady Lisle to provide everything else for her daughter's comforts and to ensure they were wise and discreet, obedient and to be virtuous and pious. Not much, then. It was another hint of the steely nature hiding beneath Jane's quiet demeanour. Had she lived longer than she did and grown in confidence, it's highly likely more of this side of her would have come out. In September 1537, Jane went into her confinement, surrounded by the best midwives and royal physicians available. By the afternoon of the 9th of October, Jane's labour pains finally started. Henry sent word to London, and bells were rung. Processions from churches began, and masses were sung for the health of both the Queen and the imminent child thought to be a boy. Her labour would be a gruelling ordeal, going on for 3 days and 3 nights. Jane's difficult delivery finally came to an end at 2 a.m. on the 12th of October, when she gave birth naturally to a healthy boy with fair hair on his little head. Henry rode, immediately to see his wife and child, having already chosen the name Edward for his son, also bestowing the title of Duke of Cornwall on him at that moment. The king and country were overjoyed to finally have a future king. Bonfires were lit, peals of bells were heard, and people got drunk everywhere. As plague was still rampant, Henry was nervous for his child's health, and he ordered his son's apartments be washed down with soap and swept out daily. Jane would not have had much of a chance to see Edward after giving birth, as he would have been carried off to his own royal household with nursemaids and wet nurses. On the 15th of October, he was christened without Jane present as was customary, but with his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth in attendance, carrying the train of his gown. But this seemingly idyllic return to a warm family life was not to be. While Jane was still recovering from the birth, it became clear she was very unwell. 2 days later, she was suffering from diarrhoea and sickness. However, by the 18th, Jane was once again improving, and everyone thought the worst had passed. It now seems likely she was suffering from either a postpartum infection, a retained placenta, or an infection from an internal tear. By the afternoon, Jane had once again grown feverish, and she sank into a delirium for the next 3 days. Henry stayed by her side, and in the early morning of Wednesday, the 24th of October, the last rites were read to the delirious Queen, and she quietly died around 2 a.m. Ever anxious of death, Henry fled in the morning for Windsor, going into seclusion and refusing to see anyone for some time. While he did seem to grieve his third wife's passing, the suggestions from his council for a fourth marriage were met with surprising acceptance. And it wouldn't be long after Jane's death, he was already considering which bride to have for the next Mrs. Tudor. On the 25th of October, Jane's body was embalmed with her entrails removed and buried in them, Chapel Royal at Hampton Court. Her body was then dressed in a gold gown, her crown and some of her jewels. She was given a magnificent funeral, finally buried on the 12th of November 1537 in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, with Mary as her chief mourner. Despite Jane's short tenure as queen, she had managed to do everything she set out to do. She had remained queen without falling out with Henry. She had given him his mouchabeu. She had restored Princess Mary to the favour of her father, and she certainly helped raise the status of her family. Her two brothers, Thomas and Edward, would enjoy a huge amount of influence over their nephew as the years went on. Henry had certainly truly loved Jane, and he held a prolonged grief over her death for 3 months afterwards, and court mourning continued until Easter 1538. However, there is a debate over how much his feelings would have held out had Jane not given him the son he longed for, or indeed if she had lived longer. As Jane grew older, there is every chance, especially in light of having a son and possibly more had she lived, that her determined spirit would have eventually grated on Henry and caused yet another rift with a wife. In other words, Jane did not live long enough for us to know if Henry would have actually settled with his third wife and continued to care about her. It says a lot that it was probably the most successful of his marriages, and yet lasted less than 2 years. When he died, Henry ordered his body to be buried beside hers, and again, Jane's tragic death aligned with that of his own mother's. Jane was queen for a very short time, and yet her presence and single act of becoming mother to a prince ensured her legacy, not merely as wife number 3, but as part of Tudor propaganda. Long after her death, Henry ensured her portrait was included as though she still lived, as the matriarch of his own dynasty. She rose from being a mere gentleman's daughter to a queen by quietly watching and understanding how to win Henry over, and by becoming not necessarily who she really was, but by showing a version of herself he wanted to see. It would be fascinating to consider what might have been had Jane Seymour lived longer. Depending on which opinion someone has of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, Anne of Cleves was either his most unfortunate wife or his luckiest. She would survive being rejected by Henry, become an independent woman in her own right, and outlive all of his other wives. Anne was born on the 22nd of September 1515 in the ducal capital of Dusseldorf. She was the middle of 3 sisters and a brother, her elder sister Sibylla being married off at the age of 12 to the Elector of Saxony, her brother William taking over his father's duchy and her younger sister Amalia remaining a spinster her entire life. Anne's father John was Duke of Cleves and Count of Mark, but both titles he had through his wife Maria of Ulichberg. Anne was raised at Berg Castle at the edge of Solingen, which in reality had become less of a defensive castle and more of a palace by the time of Anne's birth. And despite a life of luxury, Anne wasn't given a formal education the way many women her age were in parts of Europe at that time. She was able to read and write in German, was highly skilled with needlework and tapestries, and would have had a very strict religious upbringing, although this might have differed depending on which parent she spoke with. Her father was a committed Lutheran who was heavily influenced by Erasmus, but her mother remained a devout Catholic. In 1527, at the age of 11, Anne was betrothed to Francis, the 9-year-old son, and he a parent of the Duke of Lorraine. This was all part of her father's strategic marriages for his children to strengthen his duchy against the growing Habsburg Empire. But due to Francis's young age at the time of the betrothal, and Ons for that matter, the match was called off in 1535. However, it wouldn't prevent Henry VIII years later, using this as a reason to annul his marriage to Anne. A few years later, in 1538, Henry was between wives long enough to consider having another one. Jane Seymour, the mother of his only son and third child, had died in October 1537. It would seem Henry genuinely mourned her death, as court mourning would remain until the following spring, and although he went along half-heartedly with his counsel's suggestion of marrying again, nothing really went ahead for a long time. In November, someone brought up that there were 2 eligible daughters of the Duke of Cleves, but it wouldn't be until 1538 that Henry really considered it. In 1538, the Pope also learned about the execution of Henry Paul, 1st Baron Montague, and Henry Courtenay, Marquis of Exat, in a supposed attempt to overthrow Henry with little evidence to show for it. In exchange for this, the Pope reissued his excommunication of the English king, and this in turn made an alliance with the Protestant Cleves even more attractive. For England, John knew a good offer when he saw one, and when the proposal of marriage was once again floated, he suggested his elder unmarried daughter Anne. Henry was being pushed by his council, as although he had finally been given the son, and he had always wanted Edward, not forgetting he already had 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, who would be formidable queens in their own right. Henry only had 1 son, though, and it was nice to have a spare. The idea had really been Thomas Cromwell's, and he was made Lord Great Chamberlain as a result. Nicholas Wotton and Robert Barnes, 2 very Protestant ambassadors from Henry's court, were sent to Dusseldorf in 1539 to arrange the marriage between their king and either Anne or Amalia. But when they got there, they were not greeted by John, who had recently died on the 6th of February, but by his serious and devout son, William. William had some ridiculously strong ideas on female modesty, and when the ambassadors arrived, they were shocked to find they could see very little of either woman's face or figure, as they were covered by a monstrous habit gown and veil. Apparently, when Wotton gently tried to complain of this to William, explaining that Henry wanted to know what they looked like, William retorted, "Would you see them naked?" While on the one hand his concern was extreme, it's not difficult to understand William's point of view when Henry's entire desire for a wife was based on whether she looked sexy enough, especially given his track record. As a result, Cromwell sent the famous Hans Hollein to paint portraits of Anne Amalia, but William had yet to give permission for this to actually happen. He delayed the process, and Cromwell tried to pleat Henry by stating how many people apparently extolled Anne's beauty, both in her features and in herself, as well as how gracious and virtuous she was. He had to lay it on thick. It had been his idea in the first place, but the truth was, whether Anne really was or wasn't beautiful, not many people would actually have known the answer. She had such a strict upbringing, and her brother was so protective that few had ever seen her without her many layers of clothes and veils. To give him credit, William found any excuse possible to put Henry off. He argued his sisters were so virtuous and so secluded that they would struggle at the English court known for games of passion and flirting. The German courts at the time even had dim views on women playing music. He pointed out, in view of Henry's previous wives, any woman following them would know only insecurity and unhappiness. And finally he said he was far too poor anyway to give a dowie. The English king replied to this by saying if the Lady Anne was quite as lovely as everyone was telling him, he would happily marry her without a dowie. This was an offer the impoverished William couldn't turn down, and he agreed to the portraits being painted. Hollein chose to paint an face on unusual, for the time which disguised the fact she had a long nose. She's portrayed with a demure, sweet, youthful face, her hands relaxed and held together in a dignified pose, her jewelled gown and headdress showing her social station. Henry was immediately taken with her image and agreed it was an he wanted. Cromwell was relieved, and everything was going well. But by the end of August, William remembered his sister's earlier betrothal to the Duke of Lorraine, something that required clearing in the ecclesiastical court before her marriage to Henry. Luckily, with inquiries made from both England and Cleves, no pre-contract of marriage was ever found. On the 4th of September 1539, Anne's marriage contract to Henry was signed. It was decided, as Anne had never travelled by sea, that she would make her way to England with her entourage over land through Kallala rather than through the Baltic Sea. Anne left Cleves in early November, but her journey was slow and she didn't reach Kallala until the 11th of December. Henry was eager for his bride to arrive and in high spirits, asking his ambassadors for more details about her. He was assured she was tall and thin, of average beauty, and had a resolute countenance. So basically, Anne didn't look anything at all like Henry's favourite type of woman. But he was so blinded by what he thought she would be that he ignored this. Finally, on the 27th of December, Anne arrived at Dover, pressing on towards Canterbury just a few days later on the 29th with wind and hail blowing in her face before travelling to Rochester Abbey on New Year's Eve. She'd been given a magnificent welcome with many lords and ladies of court jostling for a position in the new Queen's household, and everyone was impressed with her manners, her looks, and how merry she was despite the journey. Anne reportedly said how eager she was to make up for her lack of education by learning English as fast as possible and doing everything in her power to please the king. Not one person said anything negative about Anne or her looks. However, Anne and Henry's first meeting was to be a fateful one. Following an old English chivalric tradition, Henry decided to first meet his bride in disguise. Following the idea that the bride was supposed to be able to see through the disguise and recognise her true love. Who knows if anyone mentioned to Henry that Anne wouldn't have a clue about these English courtly traditions, and if they had, would he have even listened? Anne was sat watching Bear baiting out of her window when Henry burst into the room in a ragged cloak, claiming to be a messenger with a gift from the king. Also bearing in mind that at this time she didn't understand English, he grabbed the poor woman in his arms and kissed her with no warning. Instead of swooning into his arms, Anne was understandably horrified at this obese uncouth peasant grabbing her and kissing her against her will, speaking in a language she did not yet know. She recoiled and turned back to the window, probably shaken and uncertain as to what to do. She was a foreign noblewoman who had just been assaulted in her own rooms, and no one there had done anything to stop it. Was this how she was going to be treated in England? Henry was surrounded at all times by TUDA yes men and women who had been trained to stare adoringly at their king and reassure him that despite the years that had passed, his gout and growing stomach, his ability to kill off a wife as soon as look at her and his horrific temper, he was absolutely definitely still the most attractive prince in all Christendom. And being repulsed by him was probably the first time it had ever happened. Unlike with so many other times in his life, the English king chose to turn the insult around on the other person. It wasn't he who was disgusting. It was Anne, despite the fact that just a few minutes earlier he was happy to scoop her into his arms for a snog. Henry left and returned a few minutes later in his regal clothing, and poor Anne must have been, as he no doubt wanted, incredibly embarrassed when she realised what had happened. She sank to her knees to receive the king, and he pulled her up and kissed her on the mouth in the English tradition. The two had a halting conversation with the aid of a translator and ate supper together, but it was clear Henry's ego had been bruised beyond repair. He had brought a gift of furs for his new queen, but left in such a hurry that someone had to go back later and present it to Anne. He angrily took his courtiers to one side, stating, "I like her not. She is nothing as well as she was spoken of." Of course, everyone around him immediately agreed with Henry that Anne was not attractive, not daring to argue with him. Interestingly, those not associated with Henry, such as the French diplomat Charles de Maria, said Anne was of middling beauty, which was higher praise than he would later give Catherine Howard, whom Henry thought was a stunner. Henry immediately sent his counsel and advisers to look for anything to help him wriggle out of his imminent marriage. He then demanded Anne appear before him and swear to being free of impediments, probably hoping she would be offended by this and not do it. But in fact, Anne willingly turned up at court and did as asked. It was impossible. No way out could be found, and rejecting his new bride would mean losing his new German allies, something Henry could not afford to do. Funnily enough, although Henry immediately blamed Cromwell for apparently lying to him about Anne's appearance, he never blamed Holine and continued to give him commissions. It suggests Holine may have painted a flattering portrait, sure, but not a fake one. There was no way out. And on the 6th of January 1540, Henry and Anne were married at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. But the next day, Henry said he had been unable to consummate the marriage, apparently due to the fact Anne smelled funny and her breasts were droopy, which was taken to be signs that she wasn't a virgin. And Boleyn's remarks about Henry's impotence still stung years later, and he hastened to add that it wasn't that he physically couldn't. Of course, in fact, he had not one but 2 nocturnal emissions. Definitely doesn't sound made up. Poor Anne cannot have been unaware of what her new husband thought of her, as everyone at court will have gossiped about it. She had no one with her in her corner, however, except for the ambassadors that had travelled from Cleves with her. Her own ladies had been replaced with English ones, including a young girl known as Catherine Howard. During a conversation with her senior ladies in waiting about being a virgin, Anne replied, "How can I be a maid and sleep every night with the king? When he comes to bed, he kisses me and takes me by the hand and bids me, 'Good night, sweetheart,' and in the morning kisses me and bids me 'Farewell, darling,' when asked if that was all that happened. Anne said yes, and that she knew she was not with child. In other words, despite her lack of formal education, Anne wasn't stupid. In the TUDA period, young women will have understood how babies were made despite not being allowed to do it until marriage, and she would certainly have known the king had not consummated their marriage bed. However, Anne would also have been very careful not to displease Henry. She had even taken on the somewhat Catholic form of Protestantism practiced in England immediately on arrival. But by the 24th of June, Henry had had enough of not having a wife who drooled all over his apparent sex appeal, and Anne was sent from court to his palace at Richmond. This was apparently on the pretext of there being plague in the city, but considering hypochondriac Henry jumped if anyone so much as sneezed in the same room as him, it's highly unlikely he would have stayed in the city if there really had been plague. Instead, he was seen publicly, being rowed down the Thames to Lambeth Palace where Catherine Howard was staying and would likely have been panicking somewhat. This was always Henry's first step in distancing himself from his wives by distancing them physically. No doubt she was thinking the worst. So much so that on the 6th of July, when Anne was woken in the middle of the night and told the king had sent commissioners to speak with her on a question that needed answering immediately. She fainted when they entered her room and must have been having visions of the trumped-up charges that would be read out before her head was cut off. Luckily for her, she was assured that nothing of the sort was to happen, and that Henry was such a glowing and virtuous prince that he had wanted the legality of their marriage checked. And would you believe it, it turned out that there was supposedly a pre-contract between the Duke of Aragon and Anne. Anne put on a good show, sighing about how awful it was to lose such an amazing husband. But if it wasn't valid, that was that. What a shame. She pretended to be reluctant, but in reality quickly sent the king a letter agreeing to dissolve the marriage. As part of the agreement, Anne was to be given an annuity of around £4,000 a year, the manors of Bletchingley and Richmond, as well as Anne Boleyn's old home, Hare Castle, piles of plate and jewels, and she was to be known as the king's sister, having precedence over all other ladies in England other than the future queen and the king's daughters. Henry also decided to make it very clear that Anne was in fact still a virgin and could remarry if she so wished. No one felt like pointing out that this invalidated earlier statements he had made, and Anne was happy to agree to everything, considering the amazing freedom this wealth belonging only to her would give her. On the 9th of July 1540, Henry's clergy found the marriage to be invalid, and Anne accepted the judgment, signing it in the king's presence. She wrote to her brother to explain the situation, also adding that she would not be returning to the land of her birth, as her grants of land were hers only if she remained in England. And besides, she added, she liked it here. William received the news somewhat moderately, publicly saying he was glad his sister had fared no worse. Everyone knew what he meant. Privately, he thought Henry's treatment of his sister was disgusting, and he worried about Anne being persecuted for her faith, something that would thankfully never come to pass. But Anne was perfectly content. She was now a wealthy and independent young woman, and was reported to often be merry and amused herself with sports and recreations, constantly wearing new fashionable gowns. Anne and Henry even struck up a friendship, and she was often invited to court. In a country now used to cast aside queens, creating fury, chaos and havoc, it was surprising to see how cheerfully Anne took the news, and Henry showed his gratitude by showering her with gifts and letters from her brother. On top of this, Anne had come to know Mary and Elizabeth quite well by this point, and she had struck up a warm friendship with Princess Mary. But she was especially fond of little Princess Elizabeth, now nearly 7 years old, who was given far less attention than her apparent brother. Anne was a kind woman who immediately felt her maternal energy, which was unlikely to be fulfilled by her own children, as she had no desire to marry again could be spent on this charming little daughter of the king. She asked the king if sometimes Elizabeth could be allowed to visit her, and permission was readily given, resulting in the young princess becoming a regular visitor at Richmond Palace. During Henry's marriage to Catherine Howard, Anne was happy to retire to the country and enjoy herself with pleasures and pastimes away from court. It seems she also enjoyed cooking, as she had a kitchen built just for herself on one of her estates in order to experiment with meats and spices. However, not everyone got a happy ending from this. Cromwell was placed firmly as the bad guy who had got it wrong, and Henry, who wanted rid of him for other reasons, decided to do away with him altogether. On the 28th of July 1540, Thomas Cromwell was led to Tower Hill to be executed, allowed a decapitation despite his lack of nobility. It was a bungled execution, with the axeman requiring 2 strokes to sever Cromwell's head. Henry's once right-hand man meeting the same fate as Anne Boleyn, the woman whose downfall he had been part of. After Catherine Howard's execution on the 13th of February, 1542, Anne's brother, Duke William, sent word to the king on the subject of his sister once again becoming his wife. The people of England really liked her, and it would have been a sensible option. Henry was quick to shoot the idea down, probably much to Anne's relief. However, she was a smart girl, and she publicly bemoaned the fact she had been rejected once more by, the most awesome king ever. Pamphlets were even written about this, and Henry was so flattered that he assured Anne that while he would not be her husband, she was secure in the position of always being his beloved sister. When Henry married for the 6th and final time to Catherine P., Anne's response was classic, apparently stating, "Madame P is taking a great burden on herself." Anne largely retreated from public life, and when Henry died on the 28th of January 1547, her right to live in Bletchingley and Richmond was revoked by Edward V's council. She therefore only lived at He Castle, throwing herself into renovating it to her tastes. She made no public appearances during Edward's short reign, but she did send many letters to him, complaining about the financial disagreement she had with Thomas Master of Rebels, who was in charge of her purse strings. It wasn't until after Edward's death that Anne would once again be seen in public. She had remained firm friends with Mary, even after her ascension to the throne, and on the 4th of August 1553, and wrote to Mary to congratulate her on her marriage to Philip of Spain. On the day of Mary's coronation, the 28th of September 1553, and travelled in a position of honour in a litter behind the new queens. This would be her last public appearance. As the country was once again told to conform to Catholicism, Anne readily agreed to convert to Catholicism herself, something that was encouraged and praised in letters from Mary. This may seem strange considering she was represented as a Lutheran Protestant, but in truth, we have to remember her upbringing had involved a Lutheran father and a Catholic mother. Anne no doubt was able to find an accord between these two religions the way her parents obviously had. The only time Anne would raise any unwarranted suspicion was in the wake of Wyatt's rebellion in 1554. Mary's paranoia led to her becoming suspicious of her Protestant sister Elizabeth, perhaps being involved in the plot by proxy, and who still had a close maternal relationship with the young princess. The imperial ambassador Simon Reard remarked that Mary was convinced Anne had written to her brother William to ask for aid for Elizabeth through helping the rebellion. While it's possible Anne may have written to William with the thought of protecting Elizabeth in some way with support from Cleves, it's highly unlikely she would have involved herself in a plot against the Queen. Either way, after 1554, Anne would never again be asked to come back to court. Sometime before 1557, Anne's health suffered, and it's now postulated she may have had cancer. Mary allowed her to move to Chelsea Old Manor, and it was here that Anne would write out her will. She missed out no one, including the many dozens of servants in her household, ensuring everyone got something from money or jewels to dowies and plate. She asked Mary that the rents from her lands be used to pay off her debts, and that one of her maids be taken into Elizabeth's service, and died on the 16th of July 1557, the last of Henry's wives to pass away. Whatever suspicions Mary may have had, she held far deeper feelings for her friend, and she ensured Anne was given the royal funeral she deserved. Anne was buried in Westminster Abbey with a full Catholic service, and her tomb was draped with cloth of gold. The Queen also commissioned a grand tomb for her former stepmother, but sadly it was never completed. into the reign of James I, work was still being done on it, but there were more pressing places for funds and work eventually stopped. Anne's tomb was marked only with two small initials, A and C, until 1970 when a small plaque was placed on it. Anne may not have become a wife for more than a few months, or a mother or a woman who had grand designs for power, but she was extremely smart and extremely lucky. Anne is often glossed over as the wife who was rejected, but this doesn't consider the number of times her position became dangerous. Her careful handling of Henry's desire to put her aside shows a woman who was astute and aware of her predicament, especially one presented in a language she didn't initially understand. And this shows Anne's depth for self-preservation. She was also a quick learner, picking up English in a matter of months, as well as having a lifelong desire to learn new skills. And the English people fell in love with her truly kind and sweet nature. In short, had things turned out differently, it's likely Anne of Cleves would have been a brilliant queen. But as it turned out, Anne, and had arguably the best life of all Henry's wives, dying a wealthy, independent woman who had made great friends with many and left a good reputation behind her. The youngest and fifth wife of Henry VIII, Catherine Howard, was also arguably the most tragic. Too young to really understand what she was getting herself into. Too few people in her corner, and either too silly or naive Catherine would end up being. Queen for only a little longer than Anne of Cleves and with a far worse ending. Catherine did not have a great start in life despite her noble ancestry. Her aunt was Elizabeth Howard, mother to Anne Boleyn, making Catherine Anne's cousin, but also a cousin once removed of Elizabeth I, and she was a second cousin to Jane Seymour through her grandmother Elizabeth Teeny. She was also the granddaughter of Thomas Howard, 2nd Duke of Norfolk, who had distinguished himself under 4 kings. But her father was merely Thomas's third son, Lord Edmund Howard. The third son in any noble family was doomed to find his own way in the world rather than inheriting. But Edmund also had no head for business, and loved gambling and spending money he didn't have. Catherine's mother, Joyce, was a daughter of a minor noble, Sir Richard Culper, and before her marriage to Edmund, had already been married to Ralph Lee, the younger brother of her stepfather, and had 5 children with him. Yes, it is a confusing family tree. After being widowed and remarrying Edmund, Joyce then went on to have a further 6 children, with Catherine being roughly the 8th child of her mother. Although Catherine's birth date is far from certain, she was probably born sometime between 1521 and 1523 in Lambeth. This date has been figured out by a combination of wills from other family members, knowledge of Catherine and her siblings in terms of the order they were born in, and the ages of her later ladies in waiting when she became queen. With such a large family to provide for, and the fact Edmund was fairly useless at making a living, it meant he often had to rely on wealthier relatives for help. Catherine, along with so many of her other siblings, especially her sisters, was likely a very unwanted child. A son could help the family one day. A daughter was a drain, and needed a doughy providing in order to marry her off and make her someone else's financial burden. As a result, Catherine was a neglected child from the start, and it's highly unlikely any education was ever bothered with for her in her early years. When Joyce died a few years after Catherine's birth in 1528, it sent the family even more into her father's death, despite him marrying 2 more times after Joyce's death. But in 1531, a glimmer of hope came when Anne Boleyn was the girlfriend and soon-to-be wife of Henry VIII. Edmund wrote to Anne and asked for help in gaining funds and was given the position of Comptroller of Killala, a lucrative position, but it meant going to Killala. He had no choice but to leave behind his large family, and the children were broken up from one another. Dowies were found for 2 of her elder half-sisters, allowing them to be married off. But Catherine was sent with her probably elder brother Henry to be wards of Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Agnes was the 2nd wife of their grandfather Thomas Howard, and was a favourite at court even after his death in 1522. Sounds perfect, right? Except it wasn't. While Agnes was seen as a safe pair of hands, she was actually often at court and had little direct involvement with the raising of her wards, and she had a lot more wards than just Catherine and Henry, with several from the Howard family she had married into and several from her own teeny family. They were divided between her 2 households at Chusworth House in Horsham, Sussex, and at Norfolk House in Lambeth, and due to Agnes being absent for long periods of time, supervision was less than ideal. Catherine ended up at Chusworth House, and while her time there seems to have started off well, it would take a turn for the uncomfortable around 1536. It was around this time that Catherine's limited education was expanded upon, and she began music lessons with 2 teachers. One of these was a young man named Henry Manox, who was likely in his early to mid-20s, and Catherine was in her early teens. The two began a highly inappropriate relationship which would last until around 1538. There is a lot of debate over the exact nature of their relationship, due to differing attitudes at the time. There are some arguments that this was simply 2 young people fancying the pants off each other and taking a big risk. Then there are other arguments that due to Catherine's young age, this was at best a young man taking advantage of a naive young woman, and at worst grooming. It's certainly true that Catherine really had no one in her corner to give her any advice at all about life, least of all about sex and romance. This should have been the job of Agnes Howard. But in her absence, this didn't happen. When the pair would be questioned years later, both Catherine and Henry admitted they engaged in sexual touching, but it never went so far as coitus. Henry seems to have put pressure on Catherine to have sex with him, and he often gossiped about their relationship with the household servants, 2 things which made her break off contact with Manox in the spring of 1538. But sadly, this wouldn't be the only sticky relationship Catherine would find herself in. A secretary of Agnes, Francis Darham, was taken with Catherine and pursued her shortly after she broke off contact with Manox. Allegedly, this did go further than Catherine's previous liaison, and the pair became lovers, but they also began to call one another husband and wife in front of others in the household, and Francis even allowed Catherine to take on some welly duties for him, such as taking care of some of his savings when he was sent away to Ireland, and it was even possible they had exchanged some kind of vows with each other before having sex. This was very important for any future marriage for Catherine, as in the eyes of the church, she would already be married. However, on one of Agnes' rare visits to Sussex, she found out about the affair and put an end to it in 1539. In order to distance the pair and also to further the ambitions of the Howard family, a place was found for Catherine at court by her uncle Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk. At this point, the relationship between Catherine and Henry was nothing to write home about. When she arrived at court, he obviously found her attractive and they flirted together whenever they met. But this was the story for many women at court. By 1540, she was put into the household of the new queen, Anne of Cleves, as a maid of honour. Henry's flirting with Catherine only grew as his interest in Anne waned quickly. Anne had rejected him, most likely when he surprised her upon her arrival in England, and her reaction of disgust at an older, unknown man with a bad-smelling leg had been too real for him. Catherine wasn't as sharp, smart, or manipulative as previous women in Henry's life had been, but she did understand men and how to flatter them. She pretended not to notice Henry's bad leg, which often oozed pus, needed to be cleaned every day with fresh bandages and smelled horrendous, she allowed Henry to feel he was once again the young, slender, athletic youth he had once been, who had picked up women by the score, despite the massive evidence to the contrary. It is often at this point that Catherine is shown as a good time girl, but actually this is more like the story of an abused young girl. Agnes had no interest in her step-granddaughter, and it's clear the Duke of Norfolk saw her as little else than a tool to further his own power and prestige with the king. Although Henry was decades older than she was and could hardly offer her the same romantic relationship as a man closer to her own age, it's highly likely that the attention the king showed Catherine made up somewhat for the lack of affection and parental care she had received in her childhood. Or as we might say today, poor Catherine probably had daddy and mommy issues. Anne of Cleves was a clever woman, and when she realised an affair was probably blossoming between Catherine and Henry, she certainly didn't care on an emotional level, as she did not care for Henry herself. However, it's likely she feared for what the king might do to remove her from the picture, knowing how his previous wives had gone out. Although it had not been absolutely confirmed publicly, it was common knowledge at the court that Henry and Anne had not consummated their marriage, making the alliance a shaky one, and with few friends in Europe due to his breaking away from the Catholic Church, Henry really needed to maintain his alliance with Anne's Protestant brother, Duke William of Cleves. But by the 24th of June, Henry had had enough of apparently not fancying his wife, even though it was likely the other way around, and Anne was sent from London to Richmond on the pretext of plague being present in the city. This was of course nonsense, as hypochondriac Henry would also have left if there had been a whiff of anyone even coughing. But it was enough to send his lawful wife away while he met up with Catherine. She had been placed in the palace at Lambeth, and Henry was spotted on several occasions being rowed in a small boat to visit her. Bishop Gardiner also entertained both Henry and Catherine at banquets, held at his palace at Sodok. It's safe to say that by July 1540, the affair between the king and Catherine was public knowledge. Completely unaware that their kinswoman already had carnal knowledge of men, Catherine was warned to maintain her pure and honest condition, while also making it very clear to Henry that she would happily sleep with him once he put a ring on it. As for the king, his lust for Catherine and his ego allowed him to believe he was both passionately in love with Catherine, and that it was reciprocated and blinded him to the Howard family's obvious manipulation. However, aside from her earlier dalliances before Henry, Catherine was already involved with someone else. On her arrival at court, before the king took a real interest in her, she had been spotted by Thomas Coe-Pepper, a member of Henry's court. He had worked for Viscount Lisle, who was an uncle of Henry VIII, helping the Viscount to obtain items for the court, including a hawk for the king himself. It wasn't long before Culper, who was described as a beautiful youth, charming, and knew how to make himself indispensable, soon became a favourite of Henry's. He had some influence over the king and was often bribed to speak for others in their favour. Eventually he was created Keeper of the Armoury, working his way up to being given the position of Gentleman of the Privy Chamber. Henry had also given Coe-Pepper several properties by the time Catherine arrived at court. The two had flirted with each other, and it seems Coe-Pepper had assumed their relationship would turn sexual, but Catherine turned him down. He moved on to another woman in the royal household, and Catherine was distraught, publicly bursting into tears in front of her fellow maids of honour. When Francis Durham heard about rumours of their marriage, he wrote to confront them both, only to be ignored by Catherine. So although she was technically single and free to marry Henry, her personal life was murky by 16th century standards. Henry had lavished gifts of property, jewels and expensive cloth on Catherine since the beginning of 1540, and it was clear he was completely besotted with her, calling her his very jewel of womanhood. The marriage of Anne and Henry was calmly annulled on the 12th of July, Anne very shrewdly realising she could have her cake and eat it as she was given lands, a generous annuity, and a whole bunch of other prizes for not making a fuss, and she was able to remain in England and avoid another marriage of her brother's choosing. This left the king free to marry again. And on the day Thomas Cromwell was executed for apparently messing up his chances by suggesting in the first place on the 28th of July, Catherine and Henry were quietly married at Oatlands Palace. Lest the public think it was a tad distasteful to be married on the day Cromwell was bumped off, the marriage wasn't made public until the 8th of August. However, a debate remains over what Catherine actually looked like. There are few full descriptions of her features, and no known contemporary portrait actually exists. Of those that have been put forward over the centuries, many are now positively identified as more likely sitters, and only a few remain with any possibility of being Catherine. There's no evidence she even had her portrait painted, and if she did, it would likely have been destroyed after her death the way images of Anne Boleyn were. The most famous image of her is a Hulline miniature dated to 1540. But a good argument has also been put forward that this is actually another painting of Cleves, who was of course also married in the same year to Henry. The two images do actually seem to show someone very similar in looks. The most likely portrait of Catherine might be Holin's portrait of a young woman. The sitter is unique in not being identified in any other portrait. It matches the little we know of Catherine's appearance, and shows a young lady in an extremely wealthy and luxurious outfit with a French hood. The Latin inscription on the portrait also suggests the sister is aged 17, roughly the most likely age of Catherine when she married Henry. As for Catherine herself, she wasn't exactly making a lot of friends at court despite her kind-heartedness. The besotted king was happy to indulge her every whim and desire, and having endless amounts of jewels and clothing thrown her way meant Catherine got a bit greedy, wanting something different and new almost every day. This behaviour disgusted many at court who thought a queen should, despite needing to maintain a regal status in high fashions and jewellery, not actually show that she wanted these things. Princess Mary also didn't like Catherine. Although she came from a Catholic family, she was a stepmother 9 years younger than her, stepdaughter, and she soon showed that she was an empty-headed girl who loved nothing more than dancing and new clothes. While these aren't inherently bad traits, she and the well-educated, deeply religious and studious Mary were never going to click well together. None of this seems to have bothered Henry. As Catherine had grown up impoverished, neglected in every way possible, and had found company only with household servants, her newfound wealth, power, and attendance went to her head a little bit. But she wasn't as arrogant about her position as Anne Boleyn had been, and Catherine was happy to use her place as queen to help others when they petitioned her. The problem was she was woefully unprepared for the backstabbing and manipulation of court, and Catherine never seemed to notice when she could be perilously close to being involved in intrigues. All Henry asked of his new young wife was that she give him a son. But despite visiting her chambers almost every night, Catherine never conceived a child during their short marriage. It would seem with his increasing weight and advancing years that Anne's accusations during her trial of Henry's infertility were likely very true. As with Jane Seymour and Anne of Cleves, no plans were made for Catherine's coronation, probably only to happen once the country had a new prince. She was also too young to take part in any administrative matters of running the country. The court was rearranged with more of the Howard family taking places in it, including in Catherine's own household, where several female members of her family became part of her entourage. At the New Year celebrations of 1541, Catherine and Henry were joined not only by Princess Mary, but also by Anne of Cleves. Although Mary and Catherine's relationship was somewhat stilted, Anne got on well with both of them. Even after Henry had gone to bed, Anne stayed up to enjoy the revelry, dancing with Catherine, and the next day Catherine generously passed her gifts from the king on to Anne. But the king's good mood, which had started when he married his pretty young wife, soon grew worse over the winter as his leg began to bother him. In agonizing pain, trapped in a failing body, Henry refused to be seen by the members of his court and shut himself away in his chambers. Even dutiful Catherine was not allowed in to see Henry very often. She was left to preside over a half-empty court, and everyone worried that the king's general health and mood meant his death was imminent, especially as he appeared to be making things worse by drinking and eating too much. However, by Easter 1541, Henry's leg had improved, and he cheered up somewhat. It must have been a relief for Catherine, who had been unsure over what to do with the change in Henry. It was also around this time that Catherine once again showed her kind nature by looking out for the plight of three people. One was the Countess of Salisbury, Margaret Pole. She had been unfairly locked away in the Tower under suspicion of helping her son Reginald to overthrow Henry, and for 2 years the elderly lady had been left without proper clothes to keep her warm. Using her own money, with the king's permission, Catherine ordered several garments for Margaret, some lined with fur, some made of luxurious fabrics to better her situation. Another 2 prisoners of the Tower also caught Catherine's attention, Sir Thomas Wyatt and Sir John Wallop, and she successfully petitioned Henry to release them both, although he did so grudgingly for Wyatt. Nonetheless, it was a popular move that looked good for both the king and queen. But once again, someone Catherine would rather not have known appeared in her life, Francis Durham. In August 1541, while Henry and Catherine were on progress, he appeared at court at Pontefract Castle. He had been recommended by Agnes, and the Queen worried that Francis would use his prior relationship to ruin her. She appointed Francis as her private secretary, but it was a very bad choice. He had a bad temper, and regularly got into fights with other courtiers, and when once reprimanded for not rising when the Queen entered a council meeting, got into a brawl. And although he kept quiet when Henry was around, it was noted that Francis was far too familiar with Catherine, and this earned the jealousy of others who were attracted to her as well. She was easily flattered by male attention, and did little to dissuade it. Added to this were rumours that she had once again started a relationship with Thomas Coe-Pepper, but soon a series of events to Catherine's downfall would be set in motion. John Lascelles, a minor courtier, came forward with a shocking reveal. He approached the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, with information that Catherine had not been a virgin when she married the king. Lascelles' sister, Mary Hall, had been a serving girl in the Duchess of Norfolk's household, and John had suggested she asked for a position in the new Queen's staff once again. Mary refused, saying how she had seen Catherine's light ways and that she had personally witnessed her sexual escapades. While having sex before marriage wasn't actually a crime, it was frowned upon, and doubly so for a woman who became Queen of England. On top of this, to 16th century folk, it suggested a woman whose morals were loose enough that she might seek out an affair after marriage. Cranmer had to tread carefully, though. Whereas Anne Boleyn had been in a similar position of being accused of adultery, Henry had wanted her gone. but he was madly in love with Catherine and would likely not take kindly to any suggestion of her wrongdoing. However, for Cranmer, here was an opportunity to take down the entire Howard faction. He first called forward Mary Hall and asked for what she knew. She told him all about Henry Manx and how he had led Catherine on, and all about Francis Durham and the rumoured common law marriage between them. Mary firmly answered that the noises coming from the bed shared by Catherine and Francis had left little doubt in the minds of the women sharing the room with them as to what was happening in the bed. On the 30th of October, when the King and Queen came to Hampton Court, Cranmer decided to slip Henry a letter about what he had learned while the King prayed in his chapel. Cranmer had agonised over revealing what he knew. And when Henry read the letter and demanded to be told in person, Cranmer said he had sent the information in a letter as he hadn't had the heart to say it in person. Henry was stunned at the accusations, but he asked the Archbishop to get to the bottom of the matter. He then gave orders that Catherine was to be confined to her quarters with only Jane Boleyn in attendance. Henry also stated he would not yet go to see her, but in fact he would never see her in person again. She was dancing with her ladies at the time, and they were sent away. Catherine's guilty conscience meant she didn't eat properly for 2 days, but actually at this point the king still believed in her innocence. John Lascelles was questioned again and repeated the same information. Then Grandma found out about the fact Catherine had employed Francis Durham into her service, and the whole thing looked very sketchy. He reported to Henry, "She has betrayed you in thought, and if she had an opportunity would have betrayed you in deed." While there wasn't actually any evidence yet of Catherine's wrongdoing, both Cranmer and Henry had jumped to the same conclusion that she had committed adultery, and the king broke down and wept in front of his council that night. Henry would never recover his vivacity for life from this point onwards, his ego permanently bruised by the idea, and he left for Oatlands Palace to spend a few days away from the public eye. When Catherine knew Henry was leaving, she attempted to run past her guards to get to the king while he was at prayer in the Chapel Royal, but she was dragged back, screaming and begging by her guards to her rooms. She knew if she could see Henry in person, there was a good chance of being forgiven, and Henry knew it too, keeping himself out of the way, as he knew he would relent. All of her relatives had pretty much washed their hands of her and found excuses to be as far as possible from Catherine, and only her uncle Thomas Howard stayed near her at this time. He was with her when she was told the news and told how she was refusing to eat or drink, and that she wept like a mad woman, and also that any implement with which Catherine might hasten her own death had been taken away. She knew what her likely end was, and someone else also suspected she would not end well: Jane Boleyn. As one of Catherine's ladies in waiting, she had been aiding the Queen in certain, as yet unknown matters, and she knew she was in danger. Her behaviour was said to turn into raving madness. The Duchess of Norfolk started to turn over her properties for any signs of incriminating evidence to prevent her entire family sliding into disrepute. Although she took the view that Catherine could hardly be punished for sex before marrying Henry, however distasteful it was to the 16th century public, Cranmer then visited Catherine on the 6th and 7th of November to question her, attempting to calm her frenzy panic with a paternal and firm manner, although initially he also intended to frighten her into giving a confession by stressing the importance of the law in this matter. As it turned out, it was impossible to get a rational conversation out of the poor, frightened girl, and instead, Cranmer handed her a letter from Henry, promising mercy if she answered all questions truthfully. It was a promise which would later be broken. Catherine confessed that there had been a relationship between herself and Francis, but that there had been no common law contract of some kind between them. But as Cranmer was leaving on the first night, Catherine called him back, saying she wished to change her statement, instead insisting that Francis had in fact raped her. Crown thought she was lying by her sudden change in statement after being left to think about it for a while, and it made him suspicious of what else Catherine might be lying about. But most importantly, Catherine denying any contract between herself and Francis meant instead of simply having her marriage annulled and being banned from court, she was making it a lot more complicated. She also replied that the only contact she had with Francis after leaving for court, and prior to him entering her household, was when he had written to inquire about the rumours of her marriage to Thomas Culpeper. This was a huge mistake because now Culpeper entered the equation. Culpeper was arrested. The evidence was sent to Henry, including the additional part that Francis had raped Catherine, and some members of the council helped Catherine draft a plea to send to the king, Cranmer also personally informed the king that in his opinion there had in fact been a pre-contract between Catherine and Francis. Henry was cheered by this news. His wife hadn't in fact been unfaithful, and although it was possible the marriage would have to be annulled, at least he wouldn't have to execute another one, right? Cranmer needed more time to find evidence of Catherine's adultery, and he knew that the chances of Henry making things up with Catherine were high if he met up with her again, so it was suggested she'd be sent to Sion Abbey, away from Hampton Court, and the king agreed. Jane Boleyn, however, was sent to the Tower to await questioning. Henry offered up all the evidence so far to Parliament, hoping to enact their disgust and also leaving out any information about a possible pre-contract, appearing to want a divorce. All parties involved were arrested and questioned as well, starting with Manx, who admitted to attempting to seduce Catherine, but getting nowhere. With her, having committed no crime, he was released by the council. Catherine Teeney, a chamberer of Catherine's, was questioned next. Tilly remembered having gone upstairs with her lady to Jane Boleyn's quarters, but then that she had waited outside with Boleyn's own maid, and that the Queen had remained in there for several hours late into the night on more than one occasion. Tildy was certain Catherine had been meeting with someone in Boleyn's rooms, but she did not know who. She also reported having to pass strange messages to Jane. Another of Catherine's staff, Margaret Morton, claimed that the Queen had grown angry with herself and another attendant at Pontefract Castle, refusing them entry to her bedroom. Margaret felt it was to keep them out for some sinister reason, and both women also testified that Jane had taken letters between Catherine and an unknown party, who at this point was supposed to be Francis. But it began to dawn on the council that Culpeper might actually be the object of Catherine's affections, and Morton confirmed this when she said she had caught the Queen lovingly looking out of a window at him, which to be fair has to be the world's flimsiest evidence, even if it was true. It did also turn out, however, that the Queen and Culper had once been left alone in her room for 5 or 6 hours, and that Morton was sure they had had sex. The council searched through Culpeper's belongings and turned up a love letter from Catherine to him, saying how much she missed not being with him at times and ending the letter, "Yours as long as life endures." It was pretty damning evidence. Jane Boleyn was finally questioned next. Knowing the penalty for helping a queen to commit adultery and fearing for her life, she admitted to suspecting Catherine of having slept with Thomas Culpeper. She stated that from all the noises she had heard them making together when meeting in her chambers, it could be little else. Jane herself had stood guard and one night had to tell Culpeper to flee quickly, for Henry had unexpectedly come to see his wife. Jane was sent back to the Tower after her testimony and finally sank into deep and not unexpected madness. Culpeper was next. Seeing little point in lying now, he admitted that he had indeed pursued his cousin Catherine, but that at first she had rebuffed him. In the spring of 1541, when the king had been depressed and left Catherine to her own devices, she had finally allowed Culpeper's advances. Culpeper stated that before long, Catherine was dying of love for him and had called him her sweet little fool. Both of them knew it was a dangerous game they were playing, and Catherine had often fretted over being discovered. He also confirmed what Jane had said, that he had met Catherine in secret in Jane's rooms, and that Jane had kept watch for them. However, despite what everyone suspected, Culpeper denied he and Catherine had actually had sex, saying that although he had wanted to seduce the Queen, she had refused him this final act. Whether this was true or merely a final act of gallantry on Culpeper's side, we will never really know. Cranmer and other council members again went to visit Catherine, hoping to bully or coerce a confession of adultery out of her, despite Culpeper denying they had laid together. But even under the most strenuous questioning, Catherine still vehemently held to her story, repeating that despite her feelings for Culpeper, she had not slept with him. Again, maybe this was true, but weighing it up with the rest of the evidence, Catherine was probably lying to try and save herself and Company Pepper, which, to be fair, no one could blame her for. Stripped of all jewels and finery before going to Sion Abbey, she was also forced to hand over a ring Henry had given her that had once graced the finger of Anne of Cleves. It was a physical symbol of her queenship being removed. Culpeper and Durham were both found guilty of high treason, and on the 10th of December 1541 at Tyburn, County Pepper was beheaded, and Durham faced the grisly end of being hanged, drawn and quartered. Their heads were put upon pikes along London Bridge. Many of Catherine's Howard relatives were also flung into the Tower, although many managed to make their way out again. No actual solid evidence had been found for Catherine's misconduct, however, and so Parliament retroactively brought in a law which made it illegal for a queen consort to fail to disclose her sexual past to the king within 20 days of their marriage or to incite someone to commit adultery with her. Catherine was charged with this new and ridiculous law and sentenced to death. There was no formal trial. When council members came to take her to the Tower by barge, she screamed and panicked trying to get away as they manhandled her onto the boat. She was led through Traitor's Gate, and her execution was planned for the 13th of February. The night before her imminent death, Catherine apparently asked for the block she would be laying her head on, practicing with it over and over and over. It's obvious her mood had sunk as low as possible, and there was nothing left for the poor young girl to think about but her execution. She had been abandoned by all members of her family, the Duke of Norfolk especially making himself supplicant to Henry, and damning his niece in far more vicious words than anyone else used, and few publicly seemed sympathetic to her plight, although in private they may have felt differently. On the 13th, Catherine was led to Tower Green along with Jane Boleyn. Catherine looked pale and distraught, but walked calmly to the scaffold with some assistance. She asked the crowd to pray for herself and the king, and also to look to her as an example of how not to live their lives, but to obey the king in all respects. Moments later, the axe came down and cut off her head with a single stroke. Jane Boleyn followed just shortly afterwards as Catherine's body was still being wrapped in black cloth by her sobbing attendants. Henry had even had a special act passed to allow him to execute people afflicted with insanity, something that had previously not been allowed just in order to get rid of Jane. She recovered herself enough to give a short speech before following Catherine to the same fate. Catherine's remains were taken to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and laid to rest near those of Anne Boleyn. Henry seemed broken by what had happened, and it would be another 18 months before he would consider remarrying to the woman who would be his final wife, Catherine Parr. Little Princess Elizabeth, who had reportedly liked Catherine Howard, was deeply affected by her death. Upon hearing of it, she declared then and there that she would never marry. Promise she never broke, so scarred was she by her father's actions. Catherine Howard never really had a chance to leave much of a legacy, dying while still in her youth, and she certainly didn't leave any good example for those who followed, except perhaps in how not to anger a murderous tyrant monarch. It cannot be denied that she made a lot of stupid choices regarding men and her life with Henry, and Catherine also knowingly at least had an emotional affair that she knew would end badly. But she was also just a young teenager full of hormones like any other, but without the warm and comforting moral compass of a parent or carer to steer her in the right direction. Devoid of love and attention, Catherine sought it out in unhealthy ways, and when she finally had a husband who, despite his age and infirmities, was happy to grant her every whim, she still couldn't help herself when someone else gave her that attention during the king's low mood. The legacy of Catherine's story is a tragic one, a reminder of how brutal life could be in the 16th century, and how brutal life could be under the wrong monarch, and especially as a woman. She was probably a typical teenager, but due to her nobility, her upbringing and her neglect, Catherine was in the spotlight in a way that amplified what she had done. Had she been born a country peasant, her liaison would probably have been largely overlooked. Her story is also a reminder of how a young person could end up with no guidance, love, affection, or care given to them and the person they might become. To this day there is a story that her screaming spirit can be found at Hampton Court, begging and weeping for Henry's mercy as she is dragged back to her chambers. Mercy that never came. Of all Henry's wives, Catherine Howard is the one least likely to be resting peacefully. The final queen consort of the House of Tudor and the sixth wife of Henry VIII, Catherine Parr would lead a dramatic life that was a study in patience, and yet she was a highly intelligent woman with strong opinions and a deep desire for romance with a fiery personality that she knew how to keep under control when necessary. Born in August 1512, Catherine was probably born at Blackfriars in London rather than Kendal Castle, her family's ancestral home. Kendal Castle was crumbling into disrepair at the time, and her parents, Sir Thomas Parr and his wife, Maud Green, were both busy at court with responsibilities, and so couldn't have gone far. Thomas was a close companion of Henry VIII, and his family were not wealthy, but were well connected to many of the important noble families in England. He himself was a descendant of Edward III. Maud was a close friend and attendant to Catherine of Aragon, serving the Queen throughout her pregnancy, and it's likely Catherine P was named after her. Maud was also only 17 when she gave birth to Catherine, their eldest child, but would go on to have 2 more surviving children, another daughter, Anne, and a son, William. Sadly for Catherine, she was only 5 years old when her father died of the sweating sickness in 1517. Maud, at the age of 22, now had to raise her 3 children single-handedly. She refused all offers of marriage for her now vacant hand, choosing instead to devote her attention to the education and upbringing of her children, as well as protecting their inheritance. Maud was intelligent and well-read as well as devoted to religion, and she would instill these values in her 3 children. Catherine would become the most intellectual of Henry VIII's wives, and maintained a passion for learning throughout her life. She was quick at learning languages and was fluent in English, French, Italian and Latin, a language in which Catherine would also later compose music. Once she was queen, Catherine also began to learn Spanish. Maud also, of course, ensured her daughters learned the traditional female disciplines of sewing, tapestry, and household management. There is a likely apocryphal story that Catherine once told her mother she was made for holding sceptres and crowns, not spindles and needles, but this is almost certainly false. When she was around 12, her mother tried to arrange her marriage to Henry Scrow, the son and heir of Henry Scrow, Baron of Bolton, and the grandson of Thomas Dacre, Baron of Gilsdale. Maud was in communication with Thomas Dacre, but the elder Henry wasn't sold on the marriage. He had some pretty unreasonable demands, including a meagre jointer for Catherine, and he also didn't want to return her dowie if the marriage was unconsummated for any reason including her death. Lady P had had enough of this by 1525, and she abandoned the idea. It turned out to be very sensible as the younger Henry Scrow died in March of that year. With her good looks as well as her illustrious family, Catherine was not short of suitors. Maud opted for a young man named Edward Burrough, who was the son of Sir Thomas Burrough, 1st Baron Burrough and the grandson of Edward Burrough, 2nd Baron Burrough, who was confirmed insane. Past historians have sometimes mixed up the 2 men, stating that Catherine married a 63-year-old lunatic, but recent research has shown this not to be the case. After Catherine married the young Edward, who was probably around her age, between 17 and 20 years old, in 1529, they went to live at Gainsborough Old Hall with Edward's father and siblings, some of whom were also married. Thomas Burrough was overbearing, violent and controlling, and nothing happened in the household without his say-so. Edward was nervous of his father, but Catherine appears to have been unfazed by Thomas's attempts at intimidation. She wrote often to her mother for advice, and it appears Maud encouraged the young couple to move out to their own household. The couple eventually moved away in October 1530 to one of Thomas's more modest properties at Kirkton in Lindsey. In December 1531, Catherine lost one of the most important people in her life, as her mother Maud died at the age of 39, probably from sickness. She deeply mourned her mother's passing, but there was more to come. Edward was also in frail health, although we know very little about him, and despite him being well enough to take over some aspects of his father's responsibilities, he had died by October 1533. Catherine was given a small income off a few properties as her dowie was returned to her, and she had no further ties to the Bure family. Now a young widow, she may have gone to stay with Dowager Lady Strickland, Catherine Neville, who was the widow of Catherine's cousin, Sir Walter Strickland at Westmoreland. It's possible this is where she met John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer, who was both a second cousin of her father and a kinsman of Lady Strickland. John was much older than Catherine, at about 40 years old, but this wasn't unusual at the time, and he had already been twice widowed. He gave her an offer of marriage shortly afterwards, as Catherine was, at the age of 21, now alone to make her decisions. Agreeing to the marriage was entirely her own choice. They were married in the summer of 1534, and they went to live in John's family estate of Snape Castle in North Yorkshire. John was a good catch. He was descended from the powerful Neville family, had a peerage and title, influence in the north of England, and a comfortable estate for Catherine to make her home. Catherine settled into married life, taking over the running of her new household and occasionally travelling with John to London for when he needed to appear at court. The marriage seems to have been content, and not much happened for a few years of any interest, although the couple also didn't have any living children. Whether Catherine fell pregnant or not, and perhaps lost any children to miscarriage or stillbirth, is not recorded. But in 1536 the pilgrimage of grace gripped the north of England, a revolt against the king's policies on the Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries, and she and her husband would be swept up into it. In January 1537, rebels attacked Snape Castle, and Catherine and her two stepchildren, John and Margaret, were held hostage. Neville was sent a message that if he didn't return home immediately, his wife and children would be killed. He returned from London and managed to talk the rebels down. But both Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell heard conflicting reports as to whether Neville was against or for the rebellion, and he was pressed to speak out against Robert Aske, one of the leaders of the revolt. He complied, and although he was viewed with suspicion, was forgiven by Henry. It's also possible Catherine's brother William and her uncle William, part Baron of Haughton, who both fought against the rebels, interceded for Neville. It may have been at this point Catherine became more interested in Protestantism. Her husband came from a deeply Catholic family, and he had been against both Henry leaving Catherine of Aragon and the break from Rome. But she sympathised with the rebellion in private, although she would publicly maintain a different view. It makes sense that the logical Catherine would prefer the simplicity of the reformist faith over the mysterious secrets of Catholicism. During the later 1530s, the couple spent most of their time in London as Neville attended Parliament. Catherine was able to visit her siblings as well as enjoy the finer pleasures of the English court with its latest fashions and styles. It was also here that Catherine would meet her future fourth husband, Thomas Seymour. At this point, Catherine maintained nothing more than a pleasant acquaintance with Seymour. She also in 1540 successfully petitioned Henry to release her cousin, Sir George Throckmorton, from the Tower. Henry granted the request, but he didn't really look any further at Catherine at this time, because he was besotted with Catherine Howard. But by the winter of 1542, John Neville's health had deteriorated. Henry, since becoming a self-imposed widower hour with the execution of Catherine Howard in February 1542, had finally taken notice of Catherine, or Mrs. Tudor No. 6. She nursed John throughout his illness, and it appears she was a devoted wife who was truly fond of her husband. On the 16th of February the following year, Henry sent Catherine an expensive gift of pleats and sleeves, as well as ordering some Italian-style gowns for her. To say it was bad taste to send gifts to a married woman with a dying husband was an understatement, and while she didn't dare to reject them, Catherine felt highly uncomfortable at receiving them. On the 2nd of March 1543, John Neville died, leaving his 31-year-old wife a large fortune to keep her, as well as making her guardian of his daughter Margaret, and providing for her dowie and future upkeep if she didn't marry. In short, Catherine was now an attractive young widow. Henry kept some distance at first out of respect for Catherine's mourning period, but it seems she remained at court after John's death for a different person, Thomas Seymour. He was only a few years older than she was, very handsome and very ambitious. In Catherine he saw a way to increase his wealth, and he understood how to pull at her heartstrings. The pair was soon discussing marriage, and this may have happened had other events not got in the way. Catherine's brother William had found out his wife Anne Boleyn had been having an affair. Not only was he pressing Parliament for a divorce, but also for the highest penalty possible for an execution. Catherine was against this, and she went to see the king herself, throwing herself at his feet. Henry replied that the law was the law, and he would only consider pardoning Anne if William relented, and Catherine answered that he would. She managed to convince her brother to calm down and not ask for his wife to be killed, and he relented, being rewarded with his divorce, as well as being awarded his now ex-wife's Essex estates. Henry was even more taken with Catherine, but he recognised she would never look his way as long as Seymour was in the picture. Catherine was respectful and friendly with the king when in his presence, but her heart belonged to Thomas Seymour, ignorant of his own heartless designs on her. On top of this, Henry was already jealous of Seymour, who was a reminder of all the king had been in his youth. He sent Seymour on a permanent embassy to the court of the regions of the Netherlands in Brussels, and then presented himself as a prospective husband for Catherine. Unsurprisingly, she was horrified at the idea. Henry was now, for the time he lived in, an old man at 52, heavily overweight with a bad leg that often smelled bad and needed redressing and grey hair. But all of this could probably have been overlooked if it wasn't in combination with Henry's bad temper, his set ways, and the fact he executed wives, enemies, and frenemies at will. But Catherine was uniquely placed to be a good fit for what Henry needed. She had already been married to an older man and nursed him, and she had been a capable and well-liked stepmother to her grown stepchildren. She would be able to take care of Henry as well as his 3 children. Catherine was also known as a steady and sensible woman who was warm, caring, intelligent and reliable. She wasn't a great beauty, but was attractive, and Henry also seems to have had a bit of a thing for redheads. The king was insistent, and Catherine eventually saw she had no way out of it and agreed to a marriage. On the 12th of July 1543 they were married at Hampton Court Palace. Anne of Cleves was present at the marriage and was perfectly content that Henry had not returned to her after Catherine Howard's death. Apparently, and said fine burden Madame Catherine has taken upon herself, understanding exactly what it was she had avoided. Thomas Cranmer and the other reformists also saw in Catherine someone who might possibly share their views and recognised that she might be the perfect person to help guide the king towards those same views. She was also a popular choice with, well, nearly everybody. Servants, nobles, and ordinary. People all liked Catherine because she was polite and pleasant to everyone, held no airs or graces, and appears to have treated everyone with the same respect. She was a well-educated woman, and while you might think this would make her more modern in her thinking, it didn't. Catherine was very traditional in her views, and she would later write that she believed women ought to obey their husband in all matters and not quarrel with him. Although she herself loved to have a good argument with Henry, especially on religious matters. When she became queen, Catherine also ensured her family was given good positions at court. Her brother William had already been placed in the Privy Council, and she added her former stepdaughter, Margaret Neville, her cousin Maud, Lady Lane, and Lucy Somerset, the wife of her former stepson John, as her ladies-in-waiting. She also immediately began a good relationship with the Princesses Mary and Elizabeth as well as with Edward. Although Edward had his own household, he had never known a mother's love, and it's likely that the kind and warm Catherine fulfilled some of this need for him. Likewise for Elizabeth, who was a precocious child who impressed Catherine with being fluent in several languages and speaking well. Mary and Catherine found many interests they shared as they were close in age, and Catherine did everything she could to ease Mary's return to court by according her the respect due to her station. This also helped Henry become reacquainted with his daughters. Although the process of repairing a relationship with Mary had begun with Jane Seymour, and Mary could likely remember a distant time where Henry acted like more of a father. Elizabeth did not have this. The king had always been uncomfortable around Elizabeth as a reminder of Anne Boleyn. But Catherine's warmth towards his second daughter began to rub off on him. It was in fact Catherine who would be responsible for reconciling Henry to his daughters and ensuring they were restored to the succession after their brother in February 1544. Catherine would also become the first queen to publish not 1, not 2, but 3 books, as well as a 4th publication made up of prayers and scriptures she wrote in her own hand. Her first psalms or prayers taken out of Holy Scriptures, an anonymous translation of a Latin work by Bishop John Fisher, was printed on the 25th of April 1544. Fisher had been executed in 1535 for refusing to bow to Henry's change in religion and take the oath of supremacy, and his name was not mentioned anywhere. But Catherine's version came out just as Henry was preparing for war against Scotland and France as news of the renewal of their old alliance reached him, and it read as wartime propaganda to encourage people to pray for their king to win his war. One of her psalms, a prayer for the king, would later be put into the Book of Common Prayer by Elizabeth when she was queen, and remains in it today. In July of that year, Henry went on what would be his final campaign to France. From that point until September, Catherine was left as regent to rule on behalf of Henry, proof of his trust in his wife. She held a good control over the country, as her regency council was made up of Thomas Cranmer, her uncle William P., and Edward Seymour, all sympathetic to her views. She also wrote many letters to the king at this time, and they show a warmth and gentleness that shows an affection was growing between them. She provided all the finances and supplies for Henry's campaign, as well as maintaining contact with noblemen in the north, keeping an eye on the situation with Scotland, and signing at least 5 royal proclamations in her own hand. It's highly likely the confident and dignified way in which Catherine conducted herself had a great effect on the young Princess Elizabeth who looked up to her stepmother. The relationship between them is shown in a book Elizabeth presented Catherine with at the New Year's celebrations at the end of 1544, a translation she had done herself of Lemire de Mars, or The Mirror of the Sinful Soul by Margaret of Navarre. What was very sweet was that Elizabeth begged that no one else be allowed to see the book, except Catherine, as she thought it was in true anxious preteen style, all imperfect and incorrect and in many places rude meaning rubbish in the Tuda era. Her dedication. The first thing Catherine would have seen was from her humble daughter Elizabeth. That Elizabeth had at the age of 11 undertaken such a difficult task to please her stepmother says a lot about their relationship, and Catherine's second book was a bestseller. Prayers or Meditations was published around June 1545, and the Queen had several deluxe copies made to be handed out at court as gifts. It was widely popular, and both Oxford and Cambridge universities wanted Catherine to become a patroness off the back of it. Catherine's book was a shining example of how women's learning was in a period of exciting change when previously only the most wealthy and noble women would even have a chance of some education. Catherine of Aragon had begun this with encouraging education for Princess Mary. But now even male scholars wanted the patronage of the Queen, and it became highly fashionable to give many daughters an education. The Queen's circle became a centre of feminine learning, and many noble women fought for a place in her household. Catherine also put Matthew Parker, a man who had once been chaplain to Anne Boleyn, in charge of ensuring the children of tenants and tenant farmers on her lands were also given at least a basic education for their age. It was not a cheap thing to do, but the Queen took the funds for this entirely out of her own privy purse. It's obvious this was an extremely important thing for her, and she never turned away a poor scholar who came to her court. However, in February 1546, Henry was told that a Protestant named Anne Askew, who was currently locked in the Tower, for being a heretic, had implicated the Queen in a confession. As it turned out, she actually hadn't said anything about Catherine at all, but it signalled that those who wanted a more Catholic-minded consort for their king were after the Queen. There is no contemporary evidence at all for a meeting between Catherine and Anne, and any sources date from the Elizabethan period. Lord Chancellor Wriothesley and the Bishop of Winchester both wanted rid of Catherine, and in Anne they saw a way of doing it. Poor Anne was tortured on the rack for several hours, being asked questions about her supposed involvement with the royal household. Despite the pain, Anne never once gave a false confession, refusing to agree to the statements put forward that she had shared books with the ladies of Catherine's household, or that she was connected in any way with the Queen. In June, as she had also refused to recant her Protestant faith, and was sentenced to death on the 16th of July, she was taken to be burned at the stake, carried on a chair as her legs no longer worked after the rack torture. Alongside her was John Lascelles, the same one who had told Cranmer about Catherine Howard's affairs before her marriage to Henry. A kind executioner hung a bag of gunpowder around Anne's neck to prevent a slow, agonising death, which exploded almost instantly. The Queen was no doubt as horrified as everyone else to learn how Anne had been carried out to the stake, but she didn't dare express any further views than that. Henry was getting a little disconcerted at Catherine's lack of an heir in their 3 years of marriage, as well as her strong views on religion that he felt were now getting out of hand. He had previously enjoyed being able to bat around ideas on religion with his wife, showing off what he considered to be his superior knowledge, but now he grew suspicious of Catherine's true feelings on Lutheranism. Catherine knew she could easily end up tied to a stake as well if she wasn't careful. After arguing one night with the king to his annoyance, it was overheard by Bishop Gardiner, who used the opportunity to convince the irritated Henry that Catherine should be investigated. She was now in real danger. 3 of her favourite ladies-in-waiting were arrested and their apartments searched. A warrant was drawn up for Catherine's own arrest on the basis of anything suspicious being found, which Henry signed, and it was given to a member of the Privy Council. Luck was smiling on Catherine that day, as it was accidentally dropped and subsequently found by one of her loyal attendants, who brought it straight to her. When Catherine read the warrant, her reaction was understandable. She broke down into hysterical tears, shaking uncontrollably and shutting herself in her room. The sounds reached the king's apartment, and he sent his physician, Dr. Wendy, to see to the Queen. When Dr. Wendy saw Catherine's agitated state, he understood at once what it was in relation to, and he sent all other servants and doctors away. Henry had confided in him about what was happening with Catherine, and Wendy advised the Queen about Gardiner and Riley being out to get her, and encouraged her to pate Henry by ceasing arguments with him. It didn't calm her, and eventually Henry himself went to see her. It's not surprising the reaction Catherine had. Henry had proven more than once he was willing to kill wives off to be rid of troublesome ones, and a charge of heresy carried a far more painful and horrific death than a simple beheading. Henry came to see Catherine himself, and he was so convinced of her grief and tears at displeasing him that he softened, speaking kindly to her and calming her down. When Henry left, Catherine had determined she would never again argue about religion, and she ordered her ladies-in-waiting to rid themselves of any forbidden books in their possession. When pushed by Henry in front of others to give her opinion on religious matters that evening, Catherine replied that it was not her place to argue with Henry's knowledge of it, and insisted she had only debated about it to take his mind off his bad leg. It worked, and Henry replied, "Is it so, sweetheart? Then we are perfect friends." Catherine's relief must have been overpowering. Henry had, of course, guessed what Rosalie and Gardiner were up to, and Catherine's loyal servant had also been careful to put the lost warrant back where she found it, which meant Rosalie was preparing to use it. The next day, the king made sure Catherine was out with him in the palace gardens, when the Lord Chancellor marched across with 40 guards at his back. Henry took him a little distance away before shouting he was a knave and a fool. Catherine maintained her innocence at the situation, as the Lord Chancellor retreated quickly with his men despite knowing the real reason for what had happened. But the aging king's health was fast growing worse, and everyone knew that his end wasn't far away, Henry, himself included. He drew up provision for his wife of around £7,000 a year after his death, made up of her jointure, plate, jewels, and as many of the king's expensive clothes as she wished. On the 26th of January, knowing he was fading fast, Henry called for Catherine to be by his side. He expressed, according to one source, gratefulness that he would die in the arms of so faithful a spouse. Although Henry was a good contender for worst husband in history, Catherine was still emotionally attached to him, and she broke down in tears. Henry said farewell and dismissed her, then seeing Princess Mary and telling her to look after her brother. When she too grew emotional, Henry gently said his farewells to her and dismissed her as well. The following night, Archbishop Cranmer was finally sent for, Henry accepting he was now at death's door. By the time Cranmer arrived, Henry could no longer talk, only able to squeeze Cranmer's hand when asked if he put his trust in God. At 2 a.m. on the 28th of January 1547, at the age of 55, Henry VIII died, leaving behind him a bloody legacy that would stain the memory of the Tudor dynasty forever. His 9-year-old son was now Edward V, ruling with a regency council, and was crowned a few days later on the 31st of January. Catherine retired from court to the old manor house in Chelsea, and it wasn't long before she resumed her romantic feelings towards Thomas Seymour. Just 4 months after Henry's death, they were planning to marry, but both knew the Regency Council would never agree. So instead, they were married in secret sometime in April, Thomas sending a large bribe of coins to young Edward and obtaining his permission for the marriage. Young King Edward liked both his uncle and stepmother and was too young to figure out what it might mean politically. The fallout was huge and obvious. The Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, Thomas's brother, came to dine with Catherine at the end of May 1547, and this was when she broke the news. To him, Edward Seymour was dismayed, but his calm nature might have allowed him to eventually accept the union if not for his wife, Anne. She was instantly jealous of the marriage, which pushed her husband somewhat below Thomas, and she began a dispute over some of the jewellery Catherine had that had been given to her by Henry. Princess Mary was horrified, and to make this worse, when Thomas was reprimanded by the council for his actions, he wrote to her and asked her to intervene. Not surprisingly, Mary told him in no uncertain terms to bugger off, and she warned her sister Elizabeth to have no more dealings with Catherine. Elizabeth didn't really listen. The only one still happy openly with the marriage was Edward himself, who wrote to his former stepmother and his uncle whenever possible. Although he was kept busy and in exchange, Thomas sent him pocket money as Edward Seymour kept the young king quite short of it. In November 1547, Catherine published her third book, a book she would never have dared to write when Henry was alive, The Lamentation of a Sinner. This promoted Protestantism, and especially the idea of justification by faith alone, which to Catholics was heresy. The introduction was written by a certain young lawyer named William Seal, who would go on to become one of Elizabeth I's counsellors. It was around this time Catherine also invited her former stepdaughter Elizabeth to come and live with her in early 1548. The young princess, now 14 years old, hated the new rigid rules at court and gladly came to stay with her. It would be a mistake that would almost ruin the princess's reputation. For Catherine, she saw a young girl still that she could nurture and watch over the education of, But Thomas Seymour had already attempted to ask Elizabeth once to marry him before marrying Catherine, of which his new wife had no idea. He took on the role of the loving stepfather in front of Catherine and away from her made his desire and attraction to Elizabeth very much known to the young girl. Elizabeth was a young hormonal teenager like any other, and she was fascinated by and probably attracted to this worldly wise, handsome older man who now shared a household with her and flattered her with attention. Seymour also took the opportunity to approach Lord Dorset about his eldest daughter, Lady Jane Grey, coming to stay at Chelsea as well. Thomas had plans that she would be an excellent match for King Edward, being a well-educated girl who was almost militantly Protestant, the same age as Edward, and she got on well with him. Dorset agreed, and both girls were now under Catherine's tutelage. Catherine and Thomas were both delighted in March of that year to discover that Catherine, after so many years of marriages with no children, was finally pregnant. As she was 35, considered rather old at that time for her first child, well wishes and advice poured in from friends and family. But she seems to have had a healthy pregnancy, but she was so distracted with her happy news that Catherine failed to see what her husband was up to right under her nose. He ramped up his efforts with Elizabeth, romping with her in front of other members of the household and tickling her. The princess's lady-in-waiting and governess, Cat Ashley, would later say how Thomas would burst into Elizabeth's room in the mornings, wearing only slippers and a nightgown, which she considered very improper behaviour. But what made this even worse was that he would only stay if Elizabeth was still in bed. If she was up and dressed, he would leave. Thomas openly told Catherine all of this, presenting it as innocent fun. Still seeing Elizabeth as a child and suitably gaslit by her manipulative husband, Catherine saw nothing wrong with what was happening, and at times even joined in tickling or wrestling with Elizabeth. Elizabeth was too young to hide her crush on Thomas well, and he attempted to divert attention from himself by saying he had seen Elizabeth through the window with a man's arms around her neck. Catherine immediately questioned her charge about this, and the young princess burst into tears, confirming she had done no such thing, and certainly she wouldn't have had any chance to do so. It set Catherine thinking, and she realised Thomas would only lie about such a thing if he was protecting himself in some way. Everything dawned on her, and knowing she had to take better care of her ward, confided in Cat Ashley, and asked her to keep watch between Elizabeth and Thomas. Catherine must have been heartbroken. Whatever truth the rest of the world knew about Thomas, she had loved her husband, and regardless of his success, he had intended to cheat on her with Elizabeth. At some point in April, Catherine realised both her husband and the princess were missing, and she went looking for them through the manor. She came across Elizabeth in Thomas's arms, and the way they both jumped apart when she entered the room told her everything she needed to know about what might have happened. It was arranged for Elizabeth to leave in May for Sir Anthony Denny's household at Chesson, and it was the last time she would see her former stepmother in person. However, after leaving, Elizabeth wrote a remorseful letter to Catherine, and as a true mother who will always forgive her child, Catherine continued to correspond warmly with the young princess until her death, and sadly, this wouldn't be far away. After Elizabeth's departure, it appears both Catherine and Thomas did make efforts to repair their marriage, helped by the shared anticipation of their coming child. In July, probably to put some distance between herself and bad memories at Chelsea, Catherine moved to Sudley Castle in Gloucestershire with Lady Jane Grey while Thomas attended court. She had a happy summer, her husband doting on her and lavishing her with every need, and noble and royal visitors poured in to see the Queen Dowager. Towards the end of August, Catherine went into her confinement and she gave birth on the 30th of August to a healthy baby girl who she named Mary, in honour of Princess Mary. Although like most men at the time, Thomas was at first disappointed to not have a son. He soon fell in love with his new daughter and was bursting with pride to give his brother news about his new child by courier. Catherine was weak after the birth, but the doctors around her thought she would be fine. She wouldn't. Within hours, she fell sick with postpartum fever and fell into a delirium that lasted a week. Half lucid, Catherine often fell in and out of the memories of what had happened at Chelsea that still haunted her, believing Thomas to still be holding Elizabeth in his arms. Some of her ladies withdrew when they realised what Catherine's state of mind was, and Thomas would lay on the bed beside his wife and pull her into his embrace to try and calm her. Her fever reduced enough for Catherine to realise she was dying, and she drew up her will. In the early hours of the next morning, on the 5th of September 1548, Catherine died at the age of 36. It would appear Thomas Seymour, despite whatever stupid ideas he had once had of seducing a future queen, had realised too late what he already had, and he was heartbroken at his wife's death. An elaborate funeral was arranged for the next day, and she was buried in St Mary's Chapel on the grounds of Sudley Castle. Her funeral was the first one to be a Protestant ceremony held entirely in English, and Lady Jane Grey acted as chief mourner. Thomas would remain in mourning for months, and he would hear no ill words spoken about his late wife. He eventually returned to public view in January 1549 after months of arguing with his brother over underhanded dealings he had made, and attempted to break into the king's apartments on the 16th, possibly with the view to kidnapping him. His trial led to the events with Elizabeth coming out alongside other matters, and he was found guilty of treason, leading to him being executed on the 20th of March 1549. His baby daughter was sent to live with Catherine's friend, Catherine Brandon, Duchess of Suffolk. It appears the Duchess was rather dismayed with the imposition of a small child she didn't want, and Mary was somewhat neglected, especially as Brandon now had to pay for her out of her own pocket, which was expensive, as Mary was a queen's daughter and had to be kept as such. This was lightened later on when in March 1550, the attainder on her father was removed from the child, although her father's properties remained with the crown. There is no more mention in the historical record of little Mary after her second birthday, and it appears she probably died around this time, having lived her short life without a mother or father's love, and as a burden on an unwilling party. Catherine had an elaborate and beautiful tomb raised by Thomas, but during the English Civil War it was ransacked and destroyed. Her tomb would again be opened by disrespectful and curious gentry in 1782, 1783, 1784, 1786, and in 1792 when vandals broke in, desecrated the coffin, and tossed the Queen Dow's corpse into a rubbish heap. She was then buried in a walled grave until 1817, when Catherine would be disturbed again, and one final time in 1861, when she was moved to a spot in the newly restored chapel. Catherine left an amazing legacy. Henry's other queen consorts left us their stories through the mouths of others, and 3 of them left heirs to continue on the Tudor dynasty. The Tudor would shape England through many tumultuous years in their own images. But one thing that would remain that Catherine would have agreed with was the prominence of Protestantism in England for many centuries. Her books continued to be printed over the years, and her prayers were included in the common book of press still to be used today. Catherine was a highly educated woman, a kind and charming queen who knew the power of words and a loving stepmother. But her weakness lay in believing the best of others, and blinding herself to the truth of what someone might do. But she lived a life that would be most acceptable to her contemporaries. Her virtue had never been in question, and she had conducted herself as queen with dignity, grace, and a warmth that touched people of all backgrounds. Catherine may not have been the last of Henry's wives to survive. That honour would go to Anne of Cleves, but she nonetheless left a mark on Tudor England that would continue on through her patronage, wisdom, and impressions on female education, if not through her own child. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.